to, but all sorts of other bits and bobs. I suppose, Martin, maybe we could start this week by looking at these various cyber attacks that have been over the last few weeks. Every time I keep hearing about, this isn't working, that isn't working. Last week it was Southwest Trains, all the way from Waterloo Station, all the way down to the West Country, down to Plymouth, etc. No, they couldn't accept any payments by card, so it all had to be cash only. Now, I'm sure that meant that quite a few people got away without having to pay for their fares. And also, of course, it meant that the machines weren't working. So the only way to buy a ticket was with cash through a ticket office. Now, I mean, this is also part of an enormous campaign being run by the Rail, Maritime and Transport Union, the good old RMT, to try and keep these ticket offices open. But what do you make of this idea of an entire network going down for a day or a couple of days or 2 or 3? We're going to hear from David Halpin a bit more about almost an entire week. One company just couldn't accept card payments, and yet we're being pushed towards this electronic money system all the time. It doesn't seem to make any sense at all.
Well, I mean, these systems, because of their complexity, are vulnerable. And they're either going to fail because of internal inconsistencies. Look at me, having worked in various parts of the economy, the IT is always failing, as anybody will tell you. Look at Birmingham City Council going bust. One of the major factors there is a failed IT project. And then, of course, it's also vulnerable to attack by whoever. So there we are.
So what was the link between IT and Birmingham? I didn't realise there was a link.
There was no. Birmingham City Council has declared bankruptcy, and it's because they've had to make. There's various reasons why, not least the massive cut in central government funding, which is true for all councils, and the main problem is that they didn't adequately pay people who were basically female employees of the council, and they've now got a huge back pay bill to pay. And another thing is they brought in a new IT system, I don't know what or to do what, but that also turned out to be hugely expensive and problematic. IT has always been expensive and problematic, even if there's no foul play. And, of course, you want to have basically systems which are robust, which means having more than one system in place, for example, cash and card, rather than just one.
It does seem as if there is a attempt to sort of putting all their eggs in one basket, with IT being sold often in these quite snazzy PowerPoint presentations to council executives, to individual councillors, etc. In the case of Birmingham, you're quite right. It was £100 million to put right a disastrous Oracle digital system that Birmingham City Council decided that it needed. A massive black hole has to be filled in the council's budget to fix. So, in a way here, what's happened is surely they're just throwing good money after bad. The idea is that, they've made a bad decision, and rather than say, well, actually, let's just scrap this whole IT thing and start again, the company that's supplying the IT is very well aware that it's much, it's not going to be, well, maybe they just don't have any kind of other option than to double down and to spend more money on the same bad IT system.
Yes, well, back in the day, Birmingham City Council would have had its own internal IT, and they wouldn't have been subcontracting it to anybody. So that's quite a long time ago, but of course that was the system. The NHS are the same. And if you've got in-house people who know what they're doing and know the system, that's less likely to fail. But of course, the Tories from the 1980s onwards were in favour of contracting out of council services. But of course, you can't necessarily do without IT. And that's one of the reasons why the dot-com bubble burst. Everybody's got to have IT. But of course, it's actually hugely expensive and you don't make any money on it. And that's why the dot-com bubble burst. Everybody's got to have it, but it doesn't make any money. And that's the problem for capitalism, isn't it?
There's two stories here, aren't there, really? Well, one is just the fragility of our IT systems. Good old Nick Land and his accelerationism, the object being that everything is actually not only using IT, but told what to do by AI in those IT systems. AI is literally used to manage humanity. This is obviously a total disaster. And in a way, you probably read some of the novels back in the 1980s, like I did, Martin. People like William Gibson were talking about this, saying, well, this is going to be the front line in the future, is individuals fighting back against this kind of almost a robotic monster of IT, which is used by elites to try and control people. And I suppose it's a sort of cyberpunk thing in a way, isn't it?
It is, but that is, of course, fiction. The reality is that, you can't avoid using IT. It's impossible. And the problem for the capitalist system was it turned out to be far, far less profitable than they imagined. You've got to spend loads of money on it, because if you haven't got it, you can't compete. Other people who've got it will beat you in the competition. But, of course, in actual fact, it doesn't make any money, which is why the dot-com bubble burst. And then, of course, 9/11 came along, and they could flood the money with, the system with quantitative easing in defiance of the textbook, because they say, oh, well, we'll just have to do this now.
But there's another story in the background of all of this, isn't there? And it's something that we were discussing back in around about, I think it was about 2014, which was when the Conservative government announced that there would be enormous great cutbacks to local government, and that those cutbacks would be incremental over the next decade. So we're now getting towards the end of that decade. And so the central government has just simply been, although they're collecting tax for the whole country, they're keeping it all to themselves almost, and giving very little to local authorities to do their statutory duties, hence people like Birmingham going broke.
That's right. That's fundamental as well, of course. And what they're doing is, of course, is that certainly in big cities tend to be run by the Labour Party, and they've got to make all these cuts because the Tory government made them have to make cuts, so that, that things like pensions for Tory voting pensioners are protected, but, things like social workers to look after child protection for vulnerable families are cut. And, it's quite cynical, because it means if you vote Labour in a big inner city area, things are, they're not going to be able to do anything. Quite possibly they're going to have to close things down.
Well, that's right.
Meanwhile, if you vote Tory in a national election, you can get your free stuff.
Education and libraries as well. This is really an assault on the poor.
It's an assault. Yes, of course it is. It's a way of supporting your own people, who generally are the better off, and making sure that the whole cost of the crash of 2008 is carried by the bottom half of the population, and that's exactly what's happened. Well, nobody at the very top has had any sacrifice at all. In actual fact, they've been like vultures, and they've made more money since the crash than they made before the crash. Meanwhile, everybody else, including people, very vulnerable people, have had services cut which are life-threatening. But hey, that's what politics in this country has been about.
I would like to make a little comparison here, which I haven't heard anyone else making, which is when the coup happened in Ukraine in 2014. And we had the new government, was it the Poroshenko government, the chocolate guy, took over as president. One of the first criticisms of him, this is literally within a few months of him taking over, was from the regions, and particularly from the Donbass region, before it had really kicked off, like the Odessa thing had happened, etc. What they were saying was, hang on, we're all paying our tax in Ukraine to the central government, but you have stopped the money flowing out to the regions. So, in a way, this is not just about Britain, is it? It's been happening in many parts of the Western world, where that tax money is just simply not being given back to the people who are paying it at all.
Well, it's not just the West. Is the Ukraine the Western world? But that's debatable. It's the same kind of tactics are used everywhere. You basically starve the people who are going to vote against you and make sure the money goes to the people who are going to vote for you. The Donbass in Ukraine was the money spinner. All the industries there. And so the bulk of the central government's revenues will have come from that part of the country. The West Ukraine, which is where the Ukrainian nationalists are strongest, is largely rural and small town. So they were being subsidised by the East Ukrainians. And that's one of the reasons why the East Ukrainians, when they were being threatened by central government, we are going to, we're going to have austerity so that we can join the EU. They were saying, well, we don't want austerity to join the EU because perhaps we don't want to join the EU. And by the way, you've just reminded us that we speak Russian and we're not Ukrainians at all. A bit like people in Ireland aren't English. A bit like people in Wales aren't English. And this is a big tension everywhere.
No, they're British.
Well, and the Ukrainians were also, but the Ukraine actually voted to remain in the Soviet Union when the referendum was held in 1991. So the majority in the Ukraine didn't want to leave the Soviet Union. But they did, because there was a deal done between who was in charge in the Ukraine at that time, Belarusian President Lukashenko and Yeltsin, and so the Soviet Union was broken up. But the majority in the Ukraine, some voted to leave the Soviet Union, mostly in the West Ukraine, but the majority voted for the Soviet Union to continue. But their vote was overridden, because it doesn't really matter what you vote for in one way. Voting does matter, but politics isn't just about voting. It's about warfare, it's about dumping stuff on people you don't like, it's all sorts of things like that.
It certainly is. So let's have a listen now to our first clip this week, which is from David Halpin, where he talks about one of his experiences last week down in using, and there's this network of these kind of farmers' supermarkets called Mole Valley. People may have heard of, where you get sort of bits and pieces for your horses and things like that. And they had a complete outage of their entire IT system too. So let's have a listen to that. Well, maybe not the IT system, but certainly the payment system, where Cpurt had been saying no. So let's have a listen to David now.
They talk about the shelves being empty as being a factor. That was the COVID thing added to that, the supply chain problems. But it certainly employs many people. And I think of those people who are signed up to mortgages, currently with interest rates rising, being actually terrorized because they won't have any jobs. And they've got mortgages to pay and the rest, and children to feed and clothe. Well, she's mostly young employees, I notice. There's another firm, like in Yeovil. Yeovil is another beaten-up town, really. A lot of quite poor people there. And Pittards, who've made gloves for decades, are in administration too. Now, what I question is whether this is being put on on skates, is whether this is in fact being done deliberately via the banks and other mechanisms, or whether it's just happening because the economy has been destabilized. In my mind also is Mussolini's quotation regarding fascism, the amalgamation or the joining of the state with corporatism. And the people who are winning out all the time now, as you know, against the small and medium enterprises are the corporations. They've just given a permission, unfortunately, for Lidl's to open a store on the edge of Bovey Tracy and on the borders of our national park, which will kill the little town of Bovey Tracy stone dead in terms of its economy, I think. They don't seem to be worried, but I'm worried about it for them. So there's a process going on, how much of it is being done willfully by various mechanisms, or how much of it is happening as the House of Cards collapse in a natural way, as it has done before in 2008. So that's what's in my mind. But now, today, I go down to Mole Valley Farmers, which has about 50 branches. It's a major supplier to farmers, to the horsey lot, and to many other people who come in for the food and other things. And I was met by a posse of very pleasant employees, most of whom I know, all they're dressed in their black uniforms, looking rather like a police squad. And they were at the door saying, "We can only trade in cash today, Mr. Halpin." Have you got cash? I said, "Yes, I have got cash." Said, "Let me in." I was followed around by the deputy manager with his clipboard, and he had to, very in a friendly way, and he had to record what I was buying. I bought £1.68 worth of onions. That was all. And he then followed me to the checkout, where a extremely obese chap I know very well then took my money. And that was recorded also. Now, they told me, the staff, that the computer system for Mole Valley, the whole lot, 50 branches, with, I imagine, thousands of employees, that the system had failed on Sunday morning, interestingly. Now, I did look up on news about Mole Valley, and there's a press release, I think, on Monday, which made it sound very serious, but it was temporary. Well, this is Thursday. So it's been going on for 4 days. And I recall that in ordering some steel flashing for a roof about 10 days ago, there was great concern that I shouldn't pay by check, but they should put on the account straight away, and then the account made sure with some input from through our online banking co-op. So there was perhaps some nervousness then about their financial status.
Now, have you done these sorts of transactions before? And have
yes, I go to Mole Valley about once or twice a fortnight. And I've been a customer with them for 45 years.
Well, so can you just clarify what the difference was? And maybe it was related to this computer outage.
Well, it was. The thing is that what I have to question is whether, in fact, they're not on the blink. I think they are. The thing is that it's not, to be quite blunt, without, I would question whether some of the management decisions are good. It's all been reorganized inside of the store in a very effective way. They have a tremendous stock for a start, and they have a lot of staff, too. And that's a factor in trying to keep solvent.
Yeah, I mean, if there's not many people around, it may simply be because people have been turning up wanting to buy things with their cards and just found that, well, they're not allowed to today.
Well, exactly so. But the thing is, I know, having been a son of a father who was a small electronic business, radio and television, how much on a knife edge business is. And I can imagine that if for 1 week they can only trade in cash, and people with credit cards and their accounts in Mole Valley are not buying things, that in 1 week they will make a massive loss. I know that. So I think that they are in a critical state, and I wonder whether they are not going down the tube.
It does make you wonder, Martin, if there is any sort of compensation for a company that has had to literally refuse thousands of people, possibly even tens of thousands, because it's quite a large network of customers being able to buy their goods. This is a way to cripple a company, isn't it, potentially?
It could, and I suppose you might be able to take out insurance banks against it by a credit default swap or something. It could, but there's also, I mean, obviously it's imponderable. I don't know enough about this particular case to say what's going on. But of course, the British economy is dead in the water. The German economy is in recession. The Nord Stream pipeline has been blown to smithereens, and the only future for Europe is recession, depression. And that will sweep everybody away sooner or later, apart from the big boy winners.
Just rounding this up, I think we owe it to all these local authorities to kind of revisit this idea of councils going bankrupt. I remember back in 2016 at the Dresden Bilderberg having a fascinating conversation, which if you're very diligent, you can probably go and find, with Volker Reusing, I think his name was, something similar anyway. He's a German lawyer that's worked on some big campaigns in Germany, and he was saying that it was called, I think the video was called, on the audio was called Nation-State Bankruptcy. So the idea here is you just make these democratic institutions bankrupt, and then you just buy up all of their assets. And of course you could potentially do the same with a country, Martin, couldn't you?
Well, there's been pressure from radical economists for some years now for nation states to be able to file for bankruptcy. Because if you've had a dictatorship running your country like Argentina for many years and borrowing money hand over fist, pay for, torture, instruments of torture, bullets and so on, why should you pay for that? And if you can declare bankruptcy, then what will happen is that the Western banks go down and countries are able to wipe out their debts. But as things stand at the moment, countries can't wipe out their debts, however they were got. There's some question about whether, a non-democratic country, why should the people of the country owe that debt when they get a democratic government? And the answer is they shouldn't. Those who that lent the money, that is the Western bankers, they should lose all their money in those circumstances. If you lent money to the Argentinian military dictatorship and the Argentinian military dictatorship is overthrown, you lose everything. Not just some
but
of
we're
it.
not really, Martin, you're talking about something there where it's a dictatorship. Actually, Birmingham City Council isn't a dictatorship.
No.
And what's happening is that the people we elect are just basically got their fingers in the dike. They are completely on the back foot. They're not able to do any of the sorts of imaginative, creative, constructive projects like Birmingham City Council has done over the years, like constructing all these reservoirs over on the Welsh border in order to bring nice fresh water in for their people, etc. So the Guardian reported on, this is Rob Davis, on the 28th of August this year, at least 26 English councils are at risk of bankruptcy within the next 2 years. A research from the body representing 47 authorities says many could follow. They're already gone bankrupt are Slough, Croydon, Thurrock and Woking, and now Birmingham too. So this is a kind of house of cards
well, it is. I mean,
going down here.
As we go forward, companies and local authorities and governments can't go bankrupt because they can print their own money. Local authorities can only borrow a certain amount.
Well, hang on.
Can't print money.
Stop right there, because if you're in the Eurozone, you can't. That's all printed by the European Central Bank.
Yes, and Britain outside the euro, we've got our own currency. Now, that doesn't mean that the country can't go bankrupt because we print our own currency. But the problem is that you can print your own currency, but it can become worthless, as we've seen the pound drifting down since the referendum of 2016, because foreigners don't want to hold the pound. And that's what we said. Crispin Odey last week, the biggest funder of the Big Break Leave campaign, he made a load of money selling the pound. And that's money for old rope.
What the Guardian is saying is that one of the things which has tipped these recent councils over the line into bankruptcy is the Bank of England increasing interest rates.
Yes, but the Bank of England has to increase interest rates if you're going to protect the value of the pound, Tony. And if they don't protect the value of the pound, inflation rises further, and then you've got to crash the economy one way or another. They're crashing the economy. They've got themselves into a position where all they can do is crash the economy. And that's what's going to happen. Germany economy is already in recession. They are the motor of Europe. Everybody in Europe we're going into a massive recession, depression. But that won't necessarily affect the Americans, who are doing quite well out of the destruction of the European industry. And it won't necessarily affect the Russians, because they've got a wholly different setup now. And it won't necessarily affect the Chinese, because they're developing other relationships with their neighbours, and they're not dependent on us at all. Western Europe and Britain, as part of Western Europe, we're going to have a very, very hard time going forward.
I'm just trying to sort of focus on things which are kind of quite a bit closer to home. We've also seen this. What do you make of this rack scandal? You know, the concrete, which is apparently faulty, which is in so many schools. It does seem to me deliberate sabotage to leave this until just, a week before the schools reopen, to decide, oh no, we're going to have to do something about this finally, which means it gives head teachers less than a week to actually deal with it, to try and reopen their schools after the holidays. And one of the biggest parts of this scandal has been, well, I mean, to me, it seems like a kind of almost a manufactured story. It could have happened at any time, but it just so happened to happen just before the schools reopen, making it more and more of a crisis. It's almost like somebody is enjoying all these crises. And the fact is that Rishi Sunak, whilst he was Chancellor, was the one who decided, no, we're not going to allow the recommended budget for school maintenance, and so we're not going to do anything about this problem. So really, he should have resigned, shouldn't he?
Well, he should resign. He should call a general election, but he's not going to do that. Well, I mean, the concrete was used because it's mostly used, I understand, for roofs, and it's relatively light. But it's only got a life, and it's got a very limited lifespan. So you've got to budget to replace it. And there was a budget to replace. I understand some senior civil servant has said, you know, we did have a budget to replace it, and it was all there, ready to go. And Rishi Sunak, who bailed out the banks, remember that, and Eat Out to Help Out, decided we can't afford to fix the roofs of schools. In any case, they're the kind of schools my children will never go to, so I'm not that bothered. And so he didn't do anything. And he's going to pay the price for that, actually, because it looks really bad to have done that, and he did do that.
Well, yeah, he certainly did. OK, so let's move on now to listen to the next clip from David Halpin. This is where we're looking at, he's looking at Russia, and also comparing what's going on there, the disaster of Ukraine, with the National Health Service.
I say destabilize, demoralize, dismantle. That's what they've done to the health service, and they did it surreptitiously. And the same technique is being applied to the other major public services. Russia and today, just think that our government, completely unopposed by Herr Starmer and the so-called Liberal Democrats and the one Green, is sending U-238 tipped missiles to the Ukraine. It's sending drones. It's in fact using satellite imagery to show the Russian positions as far as the US satellites, and no doubt we've got involved in that as well. What is on is a full-blown war against Russia. And the United States, I'm not sure whether the Republicans are on side, I imagine they are, they stated that they want to destroy Russia. They want to balkanize Russia. It's a massive country with a strong patriotism and with massive mineral resources. But that is their aim. They won't achieve it, I don't think, because they're very wily people, the Russian opposition. Good chess players.
Yeah, they certainly seem to be. Anyway, Martin, what do you think of this, what he's saying, comparing, Russia, the whole situation with the Russians to the NHS? It's almost like the deep state, the city of London, whatever you want to call them, the Anglo-Zionist empire, the people in charge are treating it all as a game.
Well, it's all there in the shock doctrine by Naomi Klein, isn't it? That's what you do. You wait for something to happen, or you make something happen. We're coming up to the anniversary of 9/11, and then, of course, you then get in there and force through what you wanted to do, which wouldn't have been possible under other circumstances. It is definitely a syndrome. They've been doing it for years, and of course involves destabilising things they don't like an independent Russia or a publicly funded national health service. So that's exactly, David Halpin is exactly right about that. You destabilise it bit by bit, and then, then suddenly in a different universe. Look at the way that public dental health has just disappeared from this country. It used to be there, and it's now gone. Just gone.
Well, yes, it's been, capitalised or whatever. He talks about him, Stürmer. This is a bit cheeky, talking about Keir Starmer, using the title of the Nazi in-house SS magazine.
Well, it's political rhetoric, Tony, which we can tolerate, but everybody's got to recognise what it is.
It's not just political rhetoric, is it? Because tomorrow at Conway Hall in London at midday is a whole afternoon of what they're calling Stop Starmer Starts Here. And this is a whole bunch of really disillusioned people from the left, many of them former Labour Party members, even one or two still Labour Party members, although whether there will be Labour Party members by the end of tomorrow is another question. What they're saying is they're asking people to join them for the launch of their campaign to stop the rot in politics. And not just pointing the finger at Starmer, but this is basically an attempt to reclaim the left, taking place at the iconic Conway Hall. We'll be highlighting the danger of a Starmer government and hearing from grassroots activists about why we must stop him. With campaign resources at the ready, this will kickstart the grassroots fight back, they hope, against the most untrustworthy political leader this country has ever seen. We heard, didn't we, from Crispin Flintoff, not the Andrew Marr show a few weeks ago, Martin. He's convinced, as someone that did a load of fundraising for the Labour Party, as a Labour Party member that was suspended and then kicked out, that actually the Keir Starmer-led Labour Party is more dangerous from the country even than the Tories.
Well, I don't accept that. I think that's just overdone. The Tories are...
But there's obviously a view out there. People
yes, there is a view out there.
It's like they see it as their job to deal with this guy because it's almost as if he's trying to occupy their political space.
What Starmer is doing, it's quite clear what his political project is. They're ahead in the opinion polls. Former Tory voters are thinking of voting for him, and that's what he's most concerned about under a first-past-the-post system. That's how it works. And therefore, people like him, the people in Conway Hall having their meeting against him, from his point of view, he can then turn round to the centre ground, to The Economist, to Rupert Murdoch and say, these people hate me, so you must love me. And they do love him. He is going to be an establishment prime minister if he gets through the next 18 months. And of course, it's quite legitimate for those who are opposed to his policies to start organising now, because it's quite likely we're going to have to take on the government almost from day one, because they're going to do all sorts of stupid stuff we don't want them to do. Not least, of course, upping the ante with the war with Russia, which, of course, most people in this country, sadly, still think is a necessity. They're deluded, but then they don't realise that the cost of living crisis is largely related to it. But you can't expect people to change their minds overnight. There's a huge media out there that fills their minds with nonsense every day, as you know. And, politics is a rough old game.
Yeah, sure is. So finally, let's have a listen to David Halpin talking about a subject which is quite close to my heart, because I had Lyme's disease a few months ago. Basically, you get it from being bitten by a tick. Although I didn't see this little tick, the little damn thing, crawled up my leg under my trousers and gave me a nasty little bite. I didn't actually feel it at all. But what happened was I got a horrific temperature for 3 or 4 days, up to 103. I didn't know what was causing it. As it turned out, it was actually this little mark, kind of red blotchy mark, that then turned into this classic kind of bullseye shape with a kind of circle with a dot in the middle. And so I had to go on antibiotics for 3 weeks. Gosh, it was awful. But anyway, when I mentioned this to Dr. David Halpin, he's probably best known for his work in the noughties in exposing the lie that the government weapons inspector expert on chemical, biological weapons and nuclear weapons, Dr. David Kelly, had committed suicide. He had committed suicide, and Dr. David Halpin was one of those dogged doctors that kept blasting away at this official lie until people realised that actually he had been assassinated or murdered in Oxfordshire over the weapons of mass destruction. And, of course, the people who are most implicated in that, two key people implicated in it, are Rory Stewart, who's now best pals with Alistair Campbell, who was Tony Blair's spin doctor at the time. He was one of the main people who had been, allegedly anyway, had actually outed David Kelly deliberately in order to put pressure on him, which was then used as a cover for his assassination and his murder. So Alistair Campbell has absolutely got many, many questions to answer about that, being one of the instrumental people potentially in the assassination of Dr. David Kelly. And yet there he does. He just appears on the BBC. The BBC don't seem to want to ask any questions about this implication. He should probably be in prison. But there he is now, spouting off his usual stuff on the TV and on the radio. That is Alistair Campbell for you. And Rory Stewart now has really palled up with him as a Tory, a prime ministerial Tory leader candidate. So an interesting pair those two make. A pretty not a lot of distance between them and MI6, I can tell you. But anyway, let's listen now to David Halpin's take on this illness, this Lyme's disease, because as he explained to me, this isn't a natural disease that a tick bites you that you get at all. It was actually something which was weaponized and designed in American biolabs.
Well, I've got up a paper which is good. It's by Makia Freeman, M-A-K-I-A, on global research, and it's entitled Bioweapons, Lyme Disease, Weaponized Ticks. Now, I don't take everything for gospel, but having read this through again, I read it when it was first published, actually, in 2019. I read it again, actually. It's about the bug which is caused the Lyme disease, called Borrelia Burgdorfia. And in fact, Burgdorfia is a bacteriologist still alive, actually, in the States. I think he was involved, actually, earlier on with some of the research. But this is a good article, actually, and it goes back. It reminds us how many times nations, Japan, America, Britain, other countries, Russia, have looked for ways of using viruses and bacteria as bioweapons, and how insect vectors can be used to distribute them. The Japanese apparently did it on the Chinese, as recorded. And, it's always very important to remember that this country is at the center of so many things. Porton Down Porton Down, the institution there is called Porton Down Defence, inverted commas, establishment. Well, you know very well that sarin was developed there, first of all, sarin, and quite a few other things are going on there now, actually, which are not all about defence. They've all, for instance, in the campus there's a firm that I've written about, it's on my website, that produces an anthrax vaccine for the US forces. In fact, they stopped importing it because it was contaminated, apparently, in 2016-17. But I just remind people, they don't know it actually, this, but in the 50s, I think Porton Down was organising the aerial spraying of a harmless bacteria, I think a coliform, over the Dorset coastline and countryside. And they were seeing how many people acquired it. I'm not sure, I can't remember the details of that. But it was no question, it was fact. And it's been done many times since in the States, using chemicals in one place. I've seen one, in fact, they used a fluorescent chemical. It was a cadmium sulfide, something sulfide, and it was fluorescent. But it was in a particulate size which allowed inhalation. So they could pick it up in lungs, obviously, and see whether it had been inhaled. But this was done to the American population, without the population being told, no doubt, but discovered later. You'd rather free a country for information like this than our own. We're much better at concealing things, like the anthrax in that island that was a testbed during World War II, where they still found anthrax bacilli a few years ago when they went to this quarantined island.
The island that David's talking about there actually is St Kilda. Now, lots to talk about from what we've heard there, but I don't know if you know, it's about 150 miles or so off the west coast of Scotland. It's like, the outermost island of the Outer Hebrides, really, and a long way out into the Atlantic Ocean. And not only was anthrax tested on St Kilda, the native population were evacuated. God knows what goes on there now, because it's so far away from land. But also it was one of the last places in the UK which was collectively managed and collectively farmed. So it was a sort of old-fashioned farming system where everyone just shared the land rather than they had one landowner. So St Kilda was a fascinating little place. I think the Scottish Nature Conservation Trust or something care for it, but just make sure you're careful you don't catch anthrax while you're out there. Anyway, what do you make of this? It seems the Americans and the British maybe, but certainly the Americans in this case, have got a kind of obsession in manufacturing biological warfare weapons, and they don't always seem to care who they use them on.
Well, I don't think St Kilda was the place where they used anthrax.
Yeah, they did. Yeah.
I think. All right. I thought it was an island beginning with G, which may be off the coast of St Kilda. But I'm not going to argue with it, Tony. I've got a computer.
You want I can dig the article a few years ago. I think we even covered it.
But the point is, St Kilda, the population of St Kilda voted to leave St Kilda in the 1930s. Anyway, that's a wormhole, really. What we're talking about here is chemical and biological warfare. And that, of course, is very, very topical, because it's my belief that COVID-19, and no doubt we're coming on to discuss this now, I'm with Kirillov, the head of the Russian chemical and biological warfare troops, and the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, Salami, who saw it immediately, and Kirillov through the fact that they've captured all these biolabs of the Ukraine, that COVID-19 itself was a biological warfare agent. And a biological warfare agent, unlike anthrax, which is actually quite unusable, kills loads of people. It's obvious what's happened. Something like COVID-19 is just tricky, and it causes problems to manage it, and therefore you can destabilise an economy with it, which is what I think was going on.
Before we talk about the lockdowns and the vaccines, which the evidence is out this week against both, it's been out for a long time, but there's just, the evidence is piling up. There's some specific stuff this week. I thought we'd do, Martin, is look at this evidence about biolabs in the United States. And I have to say it, and I don't actually like saying how wonderful Rupert Murdoch is, But Fox News have done a superb job again. I don't know if you've seen these reports of Chinese-American biolabs discovered by Fox News in California. Have you seen that?
No, but I think what's happening now is people are spinning what's been happening because they want to use it as a means of attacking China. The Chinese themselves pointed the finger to Fort Detrick.
Well, hang on, because they're not, Martin, they're not using this as a stick to beat China. They're using it as a stick mainly, actually, to beat the United States with.
No, but there's a line...
Because these biolabs are not based in China. They're based... And they're secretly based in California.
Yes, all right. I haven't read about it yet, Tony, but I'm very suspicious of Rupert Murdoch. Rupert Murdoch pushed the line of Chinese biolabs from the beginning. Now, what Ron Unz has uncovered is that there was no evidence of a leak from from Wuhan lab, but the funding for the gain-of-function research was DARPA, which is why... what's his name, Jeffrey Sachs, resigned from the board of the Lancet because Peter Daszak didn't tell him about this. This is becoming very highly politicised. It may happen that in the next few months it's going to become absolutely clear that the Western deep state created COVID. And at that point, World War III really will get going.
Yeah, well, I think, you're steering things a little bit away from the story I'm trying to talk about here. But, it's understandable since, you haven't necessarily seen it. So this is a Fox story saying that disturbing California biolab has been shrouded in mystery as links emerge to China. A California biolab discoveries include COVID-19 that they're working on, tuberculosis, HIV and malaria cultures. This is on the 5th of September this week. And a Fox News review of court records, health reports and interviews with people who did business with Universal Meditech Incorporated, UMI, a California medical supply firm, raises serious questions about its legitimacy and Chinese ties, as well as an apparently illicit biolab. The underground biolab in the central Californian town of Reedley, Reedley, population of 25,000, was discovered and immediately set off alarm bells with local officials who said they were unaware of what was taking place inside what looked like a vacant warehouse. As multiple local, state and federal government agencies continue to look into the biolab, a report from the Centers of Disease Control identified 20 different infectious disease agents inside the building, once used to package food. The report found cultures of TB, dengue, HIV, COVID and malaria interspersed with old lab equipment and slipshod storage, along with dead and dying mice, in an overall sanitary environment. We don't have all the answers to what was happening in this lab, said House Speaker Kevin McCarthy recently near Frono. This is very disturbing. So anyway, I'll put a link up on our show page at thisweek.org.uk if I possibly can later tonight, because I'm kind of struggling with the IT this week to this story. But that's the headline, Martin. Disturbing California biolab shrouded in mystery as China links emerge. Now, it's almost as if, yes, Fox has probably chucked that China bit in there to try and divert away from the fact that this looks like very much a US operation.
Well, that's right. That's why I was immediately suspicious. Because don't forget, even when they tell the truth, they're often twisting it.
Yeah, well, I think that's understandable that they've thrown that in there, because the thing is, for these mainstream press people, it's obviously what they're doing there is saying that there's some kind of covert program going on there, aren't they?
Well, as you say, I haven't seen the actual article, so let's not. I'm not going to bang my head against a brick wall arguing what's in it, because I don't know what's in it.
What do you think, though, about the idea of the, sort of old warehouse and dying mice lying around? And it doesn't sound as if this is a very professionally run affair.
Well, that's privatised healthcare in the United States for you. They've probably justified it as, this is just private initiative, off we go. Unless it was funded by the Pentagon, in which case it's basically US stuff. You'd have thought that if the Chinese had surreptitious biolabs inside the US, that COVID-19 would have broken out there rather than in Wuhan, wouldn't you? You'd have thought that's the way they'd have played it if they wanted to use that kind of technology.
Yeah, apparently the manager of this company, UMI, Karakin Kachadurian, was very secretive about who owned the company. He was never clear on who owned it. He would always dance around the subject. Now, this sounds to me as if it might be some sort of intelligence cover going on here.
Well, you're possibly right. I think the idea that the Chinese have got secret biolabs in America appeals to a certain paranoid streak in the US character, doesn't it?
I don't think they're really saying... They're saying it's got links to China, but this is clearly a US operation.
Yeah, well, I suppose that, yes, but as you said earlier, Tony, they may put the China thing in because that's the spin they want on it. If everybody realises that COVID-19 was deliberately created, and of course it was deliberately created and deliberately released, in my view, the question is who did it and who's to blame. And therefore the Chinese are then put in the frame, whereas in actual fact it's the Western deep state. Why would the Chinese release this in their own nation? They wouldn't. It's our lot that did it.
Yeah, I think it's both. That seems to me it's
not both, Tony. That's just trying to have your cake and eat it. It's either one or the other, isn't it?
It's taking place on Chinese soil under the Chinese noses, which it may not have been. It may have been, something which was prepared over here and then taken over to China. But there's clearly some sort of Chinese government approval of what's going on in the Wuhan labs. Whether this gain of function research, the Chinese aren't. I know you love to say how wonderful they are, but I'm afraid they're just another empire. They may not be quite so evil, but they are another empire that the world is having to deal with. Well, they, it seems to me, are collaborating in several ways for their mutual benefit with some rather ruthless Americans and ruthless Chinese too.
I cannot see that either the Communist Party of China or the deep state in the US would collaborate on the production of biological and chemical weapons. They are enemies. They might steal the other side's stuff. They might try and infiltrate it. If I was running the Chinese situation, I'd say, why on earth did we allow the Pentagon to fund a lab in Wuhan? That should never have been allowed. But anyway, all of these things are floating out there. Of course, a lot of people don't want to hear any of this because they just want to get, they want to have a nice summer holiday and look forward to Christmas. But the reality is that the world is in a mess, isn't it?
We don't count our listeners amongst those. Anyway, I think we'll leave it at that because, you and I don't think are ever going to agree on these things. I think that the Chinese government and the US government do on various levels collaborate and basically in places where they think the public won't realise or journalists won't realise what's going on. For example, the way the Chinese and the Americans hire out their surveillance satellites to the Chinese so the Chinese can put their own population under surveillance using US technology. These sorts of things I think do go on at the highest levels, and it may be that some people, even in your Chinese Communist Party, Martin, don't realise what's going on, and particularly if it's a military secret, they're not necessarily going to be told.
Well, that's right, of course, and the same is true of the other side. So we can speculate, but in actual fact, some people probably do know what's going on here, but we're not those people.
No. Anyway, so we're going to hear now from Dr. John Campbell. I don't know what you make of him before we hear from him, Martin. He's somebody who began as being quite supportive of the government pandemic programs, such as lockdowns, and he's rather changed his mind, particularly on the vaccines now, hasn't he? What do you make of him? Because he's actually, it seems to me, done an amazing kind of job in kind of keeping track of the latest awareness of the various hidden agendas. And he began as just a sort of someone who was kind of following the government line, but he's now really critical of many of the figures, particularly the Faucis, the Hancocks, etc., that pushed many of these COVID policies through.
Well, I did follow him at the beginning of the crisis because he wasn't really taking the British government line. He was actually demanding that the British government get its finger out and take a more robust approach. I think I'm totally with him when he's talking about the vaccines. Vaccines is a different issue from lockdowns and masks. The vaccine industry is horrendous. It's quite possible that people have been poisoned by vaccines, but that still doesn't mean that if you are, for example, a military leader in China and you think you're being under attack, you press that button that says biological warfare attack, which means lockdowns and masks.
And especially if it means that you're in a trade war with the West, and you can use the lockdowns to shut your ports down and say, well, we're not sending you any goods.
That's the whole point of what the West did. It's to knacker the Chinese economy before it really got going, and to some extent it succeeded.
Well, I think it has got going. Anyway, let's have a listen now. We've gone from Dr. David Halpin to another doctor, Dr. John Campbell, although I don't think he's actually trained as a medical doctor.
No, I think his doctorate is in something else, but it's medical related.
But he's extremely good. He's very, very good at analysing the figures and the data as it comes in and explaining it in layman's terms, cutting through the jargon for us all. And he's done, he began as someone who was doing training videos for nurses, I believe, and now he's done an amazing job every single day. He's been churning out what he thinks is one of the key talking points of what's really going on, which is we're not being told by the BBC. So let's have a listen now to Dr. John Campbell talking about how he thinks now it's proven beyond any shadow of a doubt that natural immunity is far better than a vaccine.
Oh, welcome to today's talk. It's Thursday, the 31st of August. Now, I want to bring you a study today from Israel, some more independent-minded studies coming out of Israel than other countries that could be mentioned. And this study shows that natural immunity after SARS coronavirus 2 is way better than vaccine-induced immunity. In fact, what they were able to do in Israel, they were able to get two groups. One group that had had the infection but not been vaccinated. Another group that had the vaccine but had not been infected. Of course, many people had both, that so-called hybrid immunity. But they had this group of people who had been infected but not vaccinated and vaccinated but not infected. Therefore, they could compare the two directly. And the people that had the natural infection, they found that they were 13 times less likely to get reinfected. So natural infection working 13 times better than vaccine-induced immunity. The natural infection way better. And when it came to symptomatic infection, people that had the natural infection but weren't vaccinated were 27 times less likely to get symptomatic infection compared to people that had been vaccinated but had not had the natural infection. So this study in Israel is able to tease out the pure vaccine immunity, the pure natural immunity, and finding the pure natural immunity is 13 and 27 times better than the vaccine-induced immunity. As well as that, in the group that had the vaccines without the natural infection, there was 8 hospitalised. And in the group that had the natural infection without the vaccination, 0 were hospitalised. So really pretty convincing. And towards the end of this video, we'll be asking some pretty serious questions about why politicians are continuously downplaying natural immunity, which is 13 times better at protecting against reinfection, 27 times better at protecting against symptomatic reinfection, and essentially infinitely better at preventing hospitalisation. But of course, sample was only 8 to 0, but still pretty convincing. Now, this is from completely peer-reviewed journal, Clinical Infectious Diseases. Let's look at it now. So, Oxford Academic Press, and it's severe acute respiratory syndrome, coronavirus 2, SARS-CoV-2, natural acquired immunity versus vaccine-induced immunity, separating out the two. Now, the background here is that we know there's waning protection after vaccine, conferred by 2 doses of Pfizer vaccine. It begins shortly after the injection. So the amount of immunity you get from Pfizer vaccine and Moderna starts going down really quickly. Basically, as soon as you've more or less as soon as you've had the injection, becoming substantial within 4 months. So if you've had the injection more than 4 months ago, any protection from that is basically becoming rapidly irrelevant. And this study is related to the Delta time period when people were getting really quite sick from the infection. Now, what they did, we examined long-term protection and natural acquired immunity compared to vaccine-induced immunity. So they had these 2 groups. So the first group was vaccine, not infection. So this was vaccinated but had not had the infection. And this first group here contained 673,000 odd people. So a pretty large group. So SARS-CoV-2 infection naive, that not had the virus, individuals who received 2 doses of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. Second group, they only found 62,883 people to go in that group, but that's still a good-sized group. Get some pretty good stats out of that. And these people had the infection but had not been vaccinated. So they were the infection not vaccinated group, previously infected but not vaccinated. So really quite clever, really, and that gives the opportunity for direct comparisons between the two groups. And as we see, the group that had had the infection but not vaccinated did way, way better. The vaccine being greatly inferior to natural immunity. Now, SARS coronavirus 2 related outcomes, 1st of June to the 14th of August 2021, as we say, Delta variant times when this study relates to. Infection 13 times more common in the vaccinated group, and symptomatic disease 27 times more common in the vaccinated group. I mean, if these kind of numbers, it's not 13 or 27%, this is 13 times, 27 times more likely to get infected if you'd had vaccine but not infection, as opposed to people that had the infection. Vastly superior natural immunity. Slight complication, though, is no one gets paid for natural immunity. So, of course, that's probably got nothing to do with it, but vaccines are expensive and natural immunity costs nothing. Let's hope that's got nothing to do with it. 8 hospitalisations in the vaccinated group. No hospitalisations in the infected group. Thankfully, no deaths in either group.
Dr. John Campbell there, with pretty amazing. I mean, I this is something which is always I've always felt intuitively was correct, that the way our body was designed is always going to be better than anything that these companies like Pfizer and Moderna can come up with, particularly when you know that they have the profit motive at the back of it. There's also this kind of transhumanist agenda at the back of much of this, where the idea that, particular kinds of profit-driven science can sort out all our ailments, so long as we believe the hypnotic adverts and that they're trying to sell stuff to us, and the amounts of money that they budget to bribe politicians, bribe judges, bribe officials, possibly even to assassinate some. It's difficult to know. I mean, particularly in Africa, that sort of thing has been taking place in some of the trials of these big pharma vaccines. But I mean, it seems pretty clear. The figures from Israel, Martin, are saying that the result really from natural immunity is 27 times better than from a vaccine. The vaccines concount pretty well. But of course, there is the possibility that you could get a vaccine which might help you just for the few weeks, and for somebody who's particularly vulnerable, help them survive a COVID. It almost seems as if, the injection, if it is going to be any good, which I doubt very much, but if it is should take place as you get the disease, really, almost, or just before it. Obviously, you can't judge that. But anyway, what do you make of these figures that he's presented here?
Well, I think the idea that the vaccines may either be A, useless, and B, expensive is pretty clear.
Yeah.
The thing that comes into my mind when he says, well, natural immunity is superior, it is if you survive your first infection with COVID. So you've got to add deaths of all the people who died of COVID into that group. Yeah,
what about your vaccine deaths, though?
Well, the people who've been vaccinated clearly still get COVID and die. The people who haven't been vaccinated...
maybe they die just from the vaccine.
Well, it might be, yes, but the people who haven't been vaccinated, it clearly isn't the vaccine that killed them.
Saying, Martin,
don't get that when you come to compare these groups, the vaccine, the COVID survivors who've got natural immunity are survivors of COVID. You ought really to add in there all the people who died of COVID as well, because you only get natural immunity by catching it. And if it was just like the flu, you could just catch it and just have sniffle a bit. But if it kills you, it kills you.
Martin, I think you seem to be missing the people that died of COVID despite getting a vaccine, and also those that died of the vaccine.
I've got no problem with that. Vaccine's probably the most likely thing about the vaccines. They just don't work. Yeah. That's by far the most. There's a load of money in it. We can make a load of money from vaccinating. I'm totally au fait with that. That's absolutely clear. It was a total waste of money, possibly even dangerous. But you can't just say that natural immunity is okay. Everybody realised, for example, even if it only affects a minority of the population, the health service system will collapse when all those people turn up simultaneously in your hospital. So you won't have any beds for the people with cancer, for example. Now, in other words, we're rehashing discussions that went on at the beginning of the crisis. We're now coming out of the crisis, inverted commas, and of course I am not in favour of vaccines by big pharma from the West. But fortunately in Russia and China, there are millions of people there, none of them been given mRNA vaccines by the West. And they haven't really relied on vaccines. They developed their own vaccines, but they relied on other methods. And natural immunity is clearly superior, but if you let everybody catch it, which is what Boris Johnson was proposing at the beginning of the crisis, then lots of people are going to die, and others will survive. That's fine. But are you going to just let all those people die? And also, of course, are you going to let your health system be overwhelmed?
Well, you know, our resident expert from Florida, immunologist Dr. Stanley Laham, who's part of his doctoral thesis, actually discovered a new previously undiscovered AIDS-like virus. He says about this that the natural immunity from the immune system processing the whole viron, as he calls it. I mean, he talks in this slightly technical language, but I mean that's basically all the various bits of the virus. The natural immunity processing the whole viron with multiple antigenic sites, producing multivalent antibodies. That's what he calls humoral immunity, and the killer T cells is better than the one antibody your B cells produce against the one antigen coded by the mRNA vaccine. It's such an indisputable fact that I'm amazed people still need more data. So what he's saying is your body is preparing a reception party for anything that looks even vaguely like the original virus coming back again, and also able to deal with it when it's there. This is what your body does with its B cells and T cell immunity. And Stanley says, I've been saying it would be so for 3 years with no studies required, simply by applying basic immunology principles. What he's saying is that the body does something completely different and orders of magnitude better than any any vaccine possibly could. So I think we just need to be reminded that there are various different aspects all around the outside of a virus. Your body is looking at them all and preparing, like I say, a reception party for anything that looks similar. Whereas the mRNA vaccines, Martin, are only just looking at one spike on the outside in order to try and identify this thing. And it's not surprising that they're so ineffective.
Yeah, well, I mean, mRNA vaccines, clearly, they've been developing them for years, and they couldn't get permission to put them into production because of the precautionary principle. Because it's not an old-fashioned vaccine where you take a bit of whatever it is and inject people with it. It's a wholly new technology and all the rest of it. I'm totally on board with that. Of course, the West has has been profiteering, and no doubt some possibly manipulation in that people are being deliberately experimented on. That's exactly what's happened. But don't forget, they waved all these vaccines through because they were saying we're not going to do the normal tests that we would normally do on vaccines because we've got to get the economy moving. We can't just have people sitting around in communism where people just sit at home being paid by the government to look after their health. And so we've got to do something, and we can't have communism, so we better have a vaccine.
Well, I don't think that's the main reason. I think that it was actually the whole debate was being pushed forward by the pharmaceutical industry and by their influence in these various committees, such as SAGE, as we know, chaired by the guy from the Wellcome Trust, Jeremy Farrar, and the World Organisation itself, which he is now being promoted to be their chief scientific advisor. These people are by no means independent. They've spent their lives, many of them working within Big Pharma and through the foundations like the Wellcome Trust, which fund the research. And, of course, they only fund the research which comes up with the sorts of results that they're looking for. That is to say that their vaccines are wonderful and marvellous. But anyway, what about the lockdowns? You still believe the lockdowns were necessary and a good idea, Martin?
I think if you think you're under attack, you adopt the standard operating procedure for a biological warfare attack. That's what you do. That's what the Chinese did. And if you actually look, the number of deaths in China is fractional compared to what happened in other parts of the country. Over 1 million people died of COVID in the United States of America. You may try and dispute these figures, but we're getting into silliness in my view. The other point I would make is this, is that there was a lot of what you might call, we didn't know what was going on, so obviously you adopted a cautionary principle. The other thing is that the British government...
Well, hang on a sec, because the precautionary principle means you properly test something before you inject it into your body.
You're talking about vaccines, we're talking about lockdowns. I thought we'd moved on to lockdowns, Tony.
Well, I'm saying that why should we be using a precautionary principle with lockdowns and not with vaccines?
Because... in China, nobody's had an mRNA vaccine. They had lockdowns, but no mRNA vaccines, Tony.
Well, they had adenovirus, which is a similar type of thing, actually.
Yes, so in other words, they didn't have... They're not implicated in this mRNA vaccine stuff. But they were... It was the Chinese who locked down. They were the ones who did it first.
Yes, I know, yeah.
And other people said, well, we don't need to bother with this, and then eventually they decided, oh, yes, we do.
To do it. Well, the World Health Organization, along with the IMF, advised countries to do it, and then it also gave them great big loans of money. I imagine they were loans rather than gifts, in order to try and help compensate. And some countries did it. One of the countries that didn't was Belarus. They said, no, we're not going to lock down and we're not taking the IMF money.
Yes, but Belarus is a very rural country, Tony. Nobody visits Belarus from outside Belarus, not even from Russia. I've never been there, and I've travelled all over Eastern Europe. I never went there because it's such a backwater. So they really can probably get away with it.
Well,
other places, not so much.
I think maybe we should be recommending people for their summer holidays to go there. Sounds rather nice if it's...
Well, it is. I mean, it's very flat, but a bit
boring.
If we mustn't mix up these different things. The stuff about vaccines is definitely very, very suspicious. The lockdowns are related to what do you do when something that you don't know what's happening starts to happen. And, of course, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, because all this happened just after the assassination of Soleimani, and of course, in Iran, the people that started dying of COVID were all in the top leadership. They didn't find it in a port, for example, which is what you might expect. It was in comms, which is where the Iranian leadership tends to hang out. All these people started dying. It was a different virus from the Wuhan virus. So the suggestion being made by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, and this was at the very beginning of the crisis, is that this is a deliberate biological warfare attack on us by the Americans. And, of course, they adopted lockdowns and masks, Tony, because they saw it as a warfare thing.
So anyway, it's Daniel Hannan, one of your favourite people, writing in the Washington Examiner. His headline is that the numbers are in, and we can say it with certainty, lockdowns were worse than useless, he wrote this week. And he's really looking at the many of the figures which have now come out. He's also pointing to Sweden as a fantastic example. He says that on that measure, Sweden did not just avoid a high death rate. According to Eurostat, the official EU statistical agency, it had the lowest death rate in Europe, below even Denmark, Norway and Finland, only 4.4% higher than in the previous period, compared to 11.1% for Europe as a whole. We can fine-tune that, Daniel Hannan says, calculation by factoring in age, obesity levels and so on, and asking how many people we would normally expect to die. If we do that, Sweden actually lengthens its lead over the rest of Europe. Other rankings use different methodologies, and Sweden is not always the single best performer, but it's always at or near the top of the table, far above countries that chose to incarcerate their people. So what have you got to say to that?
Well, the as I understand it, Tony, they lost more per capita than Denmark and Norway, at least at the beginning of the crisis. Also, they did have a kind of a lockdown in Sweden. It wasn't as strict as elsewhere, but there was one. And the Swedes, being very, very cautious people, they just stayed at home anyway. Because in any case, in Sweden, if you say you're ill, you can stay at home on full wages. You can't do that in Britain. You have to go to work. And I think these are the kind of issues that explain these differences. Don't forget, nobody really knows what was going on there, and it's increasingly become clear that this was a deliberate attack. Now, you either go, we'll get through this somehow, or you don't. What happened in Sweden also, of course, is the guy in charge sent all of the people from the hospitals to the care homes, just like Matt Hancock did here. And that was really stupid and led to most of the deaths. There's all sorts of different things we can say in hindsight about what may or may not have happened, but the evidence coming out that COVID-19 itself was a biological warfare agent, I think, is decisive.
It's interesting looking at focusing on Sweden, as Daniel Hannan does in this article, which I'll put up a link to on our show page at thisweek.org.uk. He moves on from the European Statistics Agency to look at Our World in Data, for example, puts Sweden's excess death rate at 5.6%, compared to 10% in Britain and 14% in the United States. The Economist puts it at 180 per 100,000 people, compared to double that, which is 345 in Britain, and even more than double, 400 in the United States. The gap is growing, says Daniel Hannan, as the long-term consequences of lockdown, from mental health problems to missed cancer screenings, begin to kick in, and poverty tends to correlate with lower life expectancy. According to the OECD, the world economy at the end of 2021 was 2.9% smaller than it would have been with no pandemic. But have a look at Sweden. Sweden was actually 0.4% larger. There's no way to sugarcoat this, he says. The people who ordered the lockdowns called needless poverty, illness and death. They did not mean to, but that's what they did. So there you have it, Martin. There's all sorts of statistics there from OECD, etc., suggesting that the lockdowns were a disaster.
Well, I'm not going to accept that, Tony. I haven't got a computer in front of me to pull up my alternative statistics. I thought we weren't really going to be debating this evening, so I hadn't made any preparation.
Well, no, it's not. Look, I mean, it's just on the principle. I mean, what I would say if I was you was, well, this may well simply be because Sweden is actually such a wealthy country per person. I mean, their standard of living is low better than everywhere else.
That's right. I mean, in the United States of America, Sweden is a social democratic country, and as I said earlier, if, for example, you've got a sniffle, you can just phone into work and you can stay off work. They said don't come into work if you've got any symptoms. And people can just say phone in, and they get full pay when they do that. In Britain, people working in the gig economy, if they phone in and say I've got a sniffle, then they're sacked and they don't get any money, and then they lose their jobs and they lose their housing. And of course, the United States is a very unequal society, and that's why any health emergency devastates the poor who live in overcrowded conditions and all the rest of it. So you can't just presume that because, this one person whose name you mentioned earlier, Daniel somebody or other, has pulled together an article with all these stats in, that's the end.
It's Daniel Hannan, who was a Brexiteer.
Well, OK, but therefore he's got an axe to grind, because they didn't like the lockdowns, because we wanted global Britain. And, of course, what's happening with the British investigation, the judicial inquiry, the recent figures have come out from that, which is that they concluded that these measures were in general effective in Britain and elsewhere. Now, what do they know? I mean, but they're the ones who are looking into it in British terms. And, of course, what generally tends to happen is we justify whatever we did, whoever we are. So we tend to say, well, we were right and everybody else was wrong. That's a usual strategy, isn't it?
That's what people with no integrity do, for sure. And the BBC I don't know if we covered this. I'm sure we did. Yes, we did. With the lady from Newsround, who was a health advisor to Nicola Sturgeon, going on to Newsround and lying to all the kids, saying that there were no consequences. The Americans have realised there's no consequences of these vaccines at all, which was just a simple lie, talking to children. So the BBC didn't come out of this all that well, and now we hear this week the BBC's disinformation correspondent in the Daily Mail and chief fact-checker Marianna Spring has been accused of lying on her CV by falsely claiming to have worked with a BBC journalist when applying for jobs in Moscow that she got. The BBC's disinformation correspondent is facing claims she lied. And she reportedly claimed to have said she worked with the BBC's Sarah Rainsford, and Sarah Rainsford denied that she had. She's facing the embarrassing allegation that she gave misleading information herself. According to a report 5 years ago, Ms. Spring was trying to get work as a freelancer in Moscow for US-based news site Coda Story. An article in the New European said when she applied to the website's editor-in-chief Natalia Antaleva in 2018, she said she had worked alongside BBC correspondent Sarah Rainsford covering the perception of Russia during the 2018 World Cup. Her CV bragged June 2018, reported on international news during the World Cup, specifically the perception of Russia, with BBC correspondent Sarah Rainsford. Oh dear, according to the New European, a former BBC journalist herself is said to have rebuked Ms. Spring after checking out the claim. So it doesn't bode well for this whole BBC verified thing that Marianna Spring is in charge of, that she needs her own information verified before she even starts.
Well, in my view, she's probably a spook. She's always been a spook. She's still a spook. That probably explains it all, doesn't it?
What do you mean by that?
She's been working with British... The idea of having fact-checkers in the BBC is copied directly from the US playbook. And the idea is that these people become like a kind of... They're like a Gestapo inside the organisation. And they basically make sure that people stick to the script that's been established, and anybody who doesn't, they're out. We know that's how it works. The BBC is better than the Daily Mail, dare I say, in terms of allowing different sorts of voices on there, because that's what their charter says they've got to do. But because of that, they've got to be kept under control. RT won't be dissimilar. They're not going to have people on RT who are consistently criticising Russian foreign policy. That's not what they're there for. They might have people saying things which are mildly critical, but they're not there to push that kind of line anymore. The BBC is there they actually see their role as helping the British government to do whatever it needs to do in terms of COVID or the Russians.
Right. Anyway, so I think it's just amazing, I think, that these people... I mean, the whole business of BBC Verify, it seems to me that there's a sort of systemic lying going on through a lot of the mainstream press, particularly on things like the Ukraine stories, the COVID pandemic stories. I mean, it's a systematic, effectively a kind of propaganda machine. But really what we're getting when we're getting the news, a lot of those news items are simply like a press release from Moderna or Pfizer, and there's an incredibly limp-wristed and futile attitude from many of these journalists who don't really ever seem to ask any sort of awkward questions. And I think they seem to know that if they do start asking those awkward questions, they may end up like Julian Assange, Martin.
Well, that's what they've done. That's why they've done what they've done to Julian Assange. You are not going to get ahead in the BBC these days by asking too many awkward questions about British foreign policy. You're just not. And it wasn't necessarily much better in the past. What does freedom of speech mean? It means that anybody can say what they like into a microphone like we're doing now, or you can have sort of more neutral organisations like the BBC or Russia Today as in its aspirations, which is going to be, we are going to give a broader spectrum of views, and we're not just going to ram a line down your throat. But at the same time, of course, everybody is grinding axes. Everybody wants what they want to happen. Very few journalists are prepared to just follow the story where it leads, and even if they do follow the story where it then leads to a situation where they're not necessarily going to use the material they've gathered, because it's just impossible. Seymour Hersh has made it absolutely clear he's got loads more detail on what happened with the Nord Stream 2 pipeline than he's willing to tell us. The reason he can't tell us the rest of it is because the people who told him would then be identified and punished. And he's promised those people that they won't be identified. Yeah. He uses the information they've given him to try and find further proof so that he can then cover, it's not clear where he got it from. Now, that is really professional independent journalism.
It is absolutely brilliant. What a brilliant guy. Cy Hirsch, they'll be sticking him in a jail cell soon because he's telling those difficult truths. But I think the thing is he's got an amazing reputation in the States. Anyway, look, one of the things we're not allowed to hear in this wonderful censored-free Britain is the Martin Bashir interview with Princess Diana, who this is the 26th anniversary of her assassination last week. And amazingly, in the evening, just after we switched off and finished broadcasting last week, our programme about Princess Diana and the interview that I did years ago with a clip from the interview with John Morgan, which talked about how under the Glasgow trauma rating, that when the ambulance first arrived in the Alma Tunnel in 1997, August, the medics that looked at Diana said that she had very few injuries and she was going to be one of the last, if not the last, of those who were injured to actually be dealt with because she was in pretty good health. And also looking at the length of time that ambulance took to get both from the hospital to the crash scene and then from the crash scene to the hospital, and the implication of many of the bits of evidence, including those submitted in Princess Diana's inquest, which with the verdict was unlawful killing, was that she may have been murdered in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. But anyway, this is all in those two books, the Murder of Princess Diana by Noel Botham, and also How They Murdered Princess Diana, The Shocking Truth, by John Morgan, which takes lots of extracts from the police reports in the UK and in France, as well as the transcript of the inquest. And so it's very sad to announce the death of Mohammed Al-Fayed, whose son Dodi died with Princess Diana 26 years ago last week. And it would be really very interesting to see what had happened with that couple if they'd have been allowed to have children. And if they'd been allowed to be the sort of celebrity characters saying this and that on the world scene, and the plans were apparently for the pair of them to go and move to Egypt, was very, very sad to hear from Harry in his when he published his book Spare last year, that it was him and William were wondering, because they'd obviously been talking to their mum about all the problems that had been going on before she died, that she may have been planning to do a disappearance and to reappear a few weeks or a few months later in another country and announce that her children could come and join her there. So these are the sorts of things which have come out about this horrific thing that the royal family, the firm, and particularly King Charles, put Diana through. So anyway, let's have a listen now to a clip which includes a bit from Mohammed Al-Fayed from this really important documentary which the royal family did all they possibly could to censor. Now it's pretty much freely available if you want to watch it online. It's called Unlawful Killing, which is was the verdict of the inquest, and the question of the documentary was Princess Diana murdered. So let's have a listen to that now.
At the inquest, experts agreed that her life could have been saved, had it not been for the suspiciously slow and furtive actions of Dr. Martino and his crew, the other members of which have never been officially identified or interviewed.
There is no dispute that at about 12:26, the emergency services in Paris were notified that there had been a serious car crash. There were 2 dead, 2 seriously injured. So all we needed at 12:35, if I may say so through you, was one call saying, look, I think we may have a real problem here. Please be at the ready.
That is precisely the conclusion that we would have put in our report.
The BBC's chief royal correspondent used to pay particularly close attention. Here's the guy that considers himself to be effectively the Walter Cronkite of British television. He's in front of arguably the story of the decade. It's unfolding, but he doesn't even have to dig it up. It's happening right in front of him. And the guy falls asleep. And not just once, but several times.
I do things differently, because I don't go by a rule book, because I lead from the heart, not the head. And albeit that's got me into trouble in my work, I understand that. But someone's got to go out there and love people and show it.
There was a powerful reason why these secret services of Britain, France and America might have wanted Diana dead. It was Diana's involvement in the campaign to ban landmines. A worldwide movement to ban anti-personnel landmines gathered speed during 1996. To everyone's surprise, even the world's most powerful politician was sympathetic to the ban.
To end this carnage, the United States will seek a worldwide agreement as soon as possible to end the use of all anti-personnel landmines.
Diana, Princess of Wales, took up the cause with a vengeance. In January 1997, she visited Angola, resulting in the greatest photo opportunity that the landmine campaign had ever had.
One down.
1 million to go. Firing.
Her involvement caused huge anger amongst governments. In Britain, Government Defence Minister Earl Howe denounced her.
2 newspapers this morning quoting unnamed minister described as a loose cannon.
Simone Simmons was with Diana in February 1997 when a government defence minister made a threatening phone call warning the princess to end her involvement with the campaign, otherwise accidents could happen.
The phone went in her little lounge and she picked it up and then called me over, and there was a voice that was in the middle of a conversation saying, "Don't meddle in things you know nothing about. Accidents can happen." She went a bit pale. She took it as a threat, and she said that to Nicholas Soames. I don't know his voice, but it was very, very plummy. And she actually used a derogatory term. She said, "Doesn't he sound like he's talking with a cock in his mouth?"
Days before she died, Diana made another visit to landmine victims, this time in Bosnia. Again, there was global press coverage, which made her even more of an enemy to many powerful forces in the armaments industry. Diana was certain that her phones were being tapped by the British Secret Services.
Every time she'd hear a click, she used to say, "Boys, time to change the tape."
We now know that her calls were also being monitored by the American Secret Services. After years of denial, they finally admitted to having almost 1,200 pages of transcripts, although they refused to make most of them public, claiming it would threaten national security. Her landmine campaign was clearly infuriating the armaments industry, while her love affair with Dodi Fayed was infuriating the royal family and the British establishment. So there were an awful lot of people who wanted Diana and her Muslim lover dead.
It's weird that at a time when you know the establishment can think of nothing worse than Dodi Fayed, son of Muhammad, marrying and possibly impregnating Diana, that she's conducting a major international offensive against landmines with all the crippling economic problems that would bring for the British establishment again.
And America.
And America. If you add all these to the mix, then if you were ever going to do something dodgy to Diana, that's the time you would do it. She'd become trouble, as she used to say to me. "I'm trouble to them. I won't go away. I won't go quietly."
Presidents have been killed for less.
I think it was an opportunist killing.
Yeah.
They had until September the 19th.
Why till then?
Because that was when the conference was going to take place in Oslo on landmines.
Less than 3 weeks after the crash, the key Oslo meeting began. With Diana out of the way, most of the world's press didn't even bother to attend.
When they killed Diana on the 31st of August, 19 days later, Bill Clinton was the only Western leader who voted against a ban on landmines. Something he would never have done
if she was alive,
had he had to look in Diana's eyes.
Many investigators believe that this was the real reason Diana was killed. Yet, the coroner barely raised the issue.
Knowledge is power.
In the years before Princess Diana was killed, she told many people that the British establishment was planning to eliminate her.
Oh, of course Diana was bumped off. She knew she was going to be bumped off. She always said she's not going to make old bones.
Diana had left a note saying that she thought that somebody was going to kill her and that it would be in a car accident.
Diana asked her lawyer told him that she had from a very confidential source in the palace, Prince Philip, planning to get rid of her in a car accident.
She wrote this letter to her butler, Paul Burrell, telling him that the royal family were planning her death. Diana said the same thing to her lawyer, Lord Mishcon, who made a note of her prediction. This old British establishment lawyer realised that the note would have devastating consequences for the royal family. So 3 weeks after her death, he handed it to Britain's chief policeman, Lord Condon. The police chief also realised its significance, so he concealed it and kept it secret for 3 years.
The first question, and we've agreed, is there a legal obligation to hand over potentially relevant material? There's an unequivocal answer to that, which is yes. Agree?
Yes, I do.
That was Britain's top policeman admitting that he broke the law by concealing this devastating evidence.
So that's an extract from Unlawful Killing. Fantastic, terrific film. I remember getting a phone call from, I think they said it was called Red Fusion in Bristol, with the producers of that asking me about what I knew. It wasn't, I mean, the only personal information I had was from a family friend who used to work for MI6, and she, for all sorts of reasons, couldn't go on the record. But she did say, Martin, a couple of things. First of all, that Diana definitely was pregnant at the time, and that was one of the reasons they were going to announce their engagement when they came back to London. And also this idea of her and Dodi moving to Egypt, with Dodi wanting to become a political figure in Egypt, even standing as to be Egyptian president.
Well, I think the potential motive that's being discussed in that clip strikes me as much more likely than, sour grapes from Prince Charles. She was becoming a threat to the establishment in various ways, and you can see that gave them every motivation to get rid of her. And, of course, they probably did get rid of her. They've got rid of lots of people over the years.
I mean, you using the term sour grapes, I mean, this isn't really the right term, is it? Because actually it was Charles that had cheated on her that caused the divorce. And she actually wasn't really going on too much about that sort of thing. She just wanted to have her own life. She also, of course, had been an insider in the royal family. And it didn't look as if she was going to be going away. One of the things she says in her interview is she's saying, I'm not going quietly. So she was going to speak her heart, speak her mind. And she, as she said in that little clip there, someone's got to do it.
Well, that's, if she had any sense of self-preservation, she wouldn't have done any of those things. But
is it stupidity, do you think, or
No,
courage?
It's not. It's because she basically was, when she got married, she was very young. She was only 19. What do you know when you're 19 years old? You think you know everything. The old joke goes, employ young people now while they still know everything. Rush. And, of course, as you get older, you change your mind about things and you start to find out more about life. And she's just evolved in a direction which was really, really unhelpful from the point of view of the British royal establishment and the British and US establishment in general. Yeah? As you say, if she went to Egypt to live with Dodi Al-Fayed and he started to run in the political system there, possibly, opposing US control of his country, because, of course, the US does control Egypt, then, you can see why these things all stack up, can't you?
What do you make of Al-Fayed himself? I mean, many people did criticise him as making his money through arms dealing, didn't they, even though he was quite swanky as the boss of Harrods?
Well, the reason why he was given British citizenship in the first place in the 1970s is because he bailed out the Tory government of that era. They were in real trouble, they needed money, he had money, he gave them money, and that's why he was allowed to come to Britain and buy Harrods and become part of the establishment. But, of course, he was never accepted. And, of course, when his son eventually starts to date the heir to the throne's wife, then really, he's risen way above his limited station as far as the old guard are concerned. So that's him. Of course he was born in Egypt. Well, why is he a British citizen? He's a British citizen because he helped the Tories out in that era.
Interesting. It does seem like there's a very definite element of upstairs, downstairs here, that this really is the British class system kicking in and saying that this family are going to have nothing to do. Of course, the other thing is they were Muslims.
Well, that's right. So you've got all of those things at work, and of course, the landmines campaign obviously was extremely irritating to those who make landmines. But the thing was that she looks as if she's about to set off a crusade about all sorts of things, and she had a big platform. You know, if she decided that she was going to campaign about 9/11, for example, and say, well, my reading of this looks like an inside job, they didn't want to take the risk of that happening, Tony. Why would they do that? And what she might have done, if she wanted to survive, is just go quietly, sit in a corner, you know, say nothing, and then, you know, she'd have been left alone, and then, you know, there would be no bother and all the rest of it. But that wasn't her character. And once you've started to speak out, you can't unspeak out either. You're stuck with it. So I think all of these things suggest that she was indeed murdered by the state. But from my point of view, I feel like saying, yes, and what about all the other people that have been murdered by the state? This is a big, high-profile case.
This is what I was coming on to. I mean, this shouldn't be a surprise, really, should it?
No, it isn't a surprise. Cathy McCarthy, who was the leading light in Belfast Sinn Féin in the 1990s, she'd never been involved in any violence. She was a bit of a whiz at getting out the vote. She was quite personable, young, and, of course, she was assassinated. But nobody's ever heard of her, apart from inside her own community. Whereas Princess Diana, everybody's heard about that. I was living in Poland at the time, and all the Poles were watching it 24/7, because it was just like spectacle. And, you know, other people just die in the dark, like, you know, the state does this stuff and nobody even hears about what happened. And nobody cares.
A lot of people did care about Diana, and it seems to me that, in a way, the death of Mohammed Al-Fayed this week has been, you know, sort of, it's just a little one line in the news, a little story, don't forget about it. Actually, there is a whole can of worms there, isn't there, about the way the British establishment deals with people that get into positions of celebrity, etc., that have got dirt on them. And, you know, this does rather give the lie to this whole idea of British justice, British democracy. At the end of the day, though, you don't think it was an accident? No, I mean, I certainly don't.
No, I
don't,
Tony. I mean, on this one, I'm in your camp. She was probably murdered for the reasons that we've just discussed. And that's because I know that the British state murders lots of other people, so they're hardly going to balk at murdering her. And, of course, that's what most people don't realise. They think that Britain is the sort of place where this stuff doesn't happen, when in actual fact it's the sort of place where this stuff does happen and has happened for a very long time. The image that Britain has of itself is extremely distorted. The rest of the world doesn't perceive us like that, which is why we get rather shocked when none of our former colonies joined us in sanctions on Russia. None of them. But don't they owe us anything? And the answer is no, they owe us nothing. And they're not putting sanctions on Russia because they know who we are. We don't know who we are. They do.
We're going to wind up part one this week with this incredible feature film. It's called The Sound of Freedom. I mean, I think Roman Polanski has just come out with another one, which, because of all the bad reviews, I wonder whether it's actually incredibly good. It's some sort of comedy about a whole bunch of super rich people that get together in a palace because they're not quite sure if the world is going to survive at the year 2000 millennium bug. And it does sound as if it could be quite a good comedy, but I do see that because of the stuff Polanski's been doing recently, his film a couple of years ago about Alfred Dreyfus, this other film, The Ghostwriter, which was all about the guy who's trying to ghostwrite a book for Tony Blair, which was a brilliant political thriller. And also, of course, his accusations of child sexual abuse, one or two, I believe, against Polanski. So, you know, maybe he's been entrapped, who knows, but he can certainly still churn out a really good film. But this has nothing to do with him. This one, I don't know if you've come across it, Martin. It's called The Sound of Freedom, and it's about an FBI agent that gets himself embroiled in trying to stop child trafficking because, you know, the basic idea is that, you know, if you're working for the US government in one of these law enforcement agencies, your job is to make sure that this sort of thing doesn't happen in the US. And, of course, you will be questioned as to whether that you should be doing anything involved in stopping these kinds of trades in foreign countries. So, anyway, before we hear Martin's comment on this film and this whole business of child trafficking, Let's have a listen now to the official trailer for this one of this year's most controversial and fascinating feature films, The Sound of Freedom.
How does that make you feel? Giving a child his freedom. Felt good. You've been at this for 12 years.
My country, 'tis of thee.
Why are you doing it? Because God's children are not for sale. It is the fastest growing international crime network that the world has ever seen.
For Homeland Security, you know we can't go off rescuing Honduran kids in Colombia.
This job tears you to pieces. And this is my one chance to put those pieces back together.
And yet somehow you have failed to bring me one real-world lead.
It's over, Tim. Close up and come back home.
So you quit your job and you go and rescue those kids.
South of that river is all rebel territory. No one can see it. What if this is your daughter? Hear that? That's the sound of freedom.
Sound of Freedom is one of those films that can legitimately change this world. So we want to ignite a fire in audiences and open their eyes to the dark reality of millions of children that need our help. Let's make this film a historic event and the start, the end of child trafficking. Theaters across this country are already selling out. Pre-order your tickets today and you can send the message that God's children are no longer for sale.
Quite a polemic political campaigning film. The Sound of Freedom is based on the incredible true story and shines a light on even the darkest of places, says the blurb. After rescuing a young boy from ruthless child traffickers, a federal agent learns his sister is still captive, so decides to embark on a dangerous mission to save her. With time running out, he quits his job. They are. You can't do it if you're working for Homeland Security, and journeys deep into the Colombian jungle, putting his life on the line to free her from a fate worse than death. Well, sounds like a terrific, gripping film. Not the sort of thing we're used to watching in our cinemas today, Martin.
Well, we are going to be watching it in our cinemas. Isn't that exactly what's happening? It's out there. And of course it's been pushed very heavily, and you heard, the English national anthem, God Save the Queen, being, the American version, My Country 'Tis of Thee. And of course, it's obviously American freedom that we're talking about here. It's not freedom in general, it's American freedom. And it's been picked up in the US by the right wing as a kind of, because they've got this idea that, all the top people are paedophiles. We all know that. We know about Epstein. Yeah, they're all paedophiles.
I don't think anybody is saying all the top people are paedophiles,
right, I'm just saying. I'm generally of the view that possibly they are, but never mind. You've got to prove it. And, of course, it won't be mentioning the Israelis who were running Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell in this film, will it? No. It'll be evil Colombian drug traffickers who are doing this, not Mossad.
Well, I haven't seen it, so I don't know.
Well, I haven't seen it either. Do you know what, Tony? I'm not intending to go.
Is also, I don't want to be too cynical. I would think that the film is also looking at how it is that this trade is, he's obviously been working for the federal government, this guy, before he's decided, look, I'm just, I can't do anything from this position, so I'm going to go over to Colombia to sort this out. But he's right, isn't he? What's happening is in the Anglo-Zionist empire in the West seems to be turning into hideous kind of mafia empire where things like child trafficking are almost ignored by the mainstream press. They certainly seem to be being ignored by the courts, apart from in the occasional cases like the Ghislaine Maxwell, Jeffrey Epstein case. And this is almost becoming the norm right across the Western world.
Well, I mean, the courts do a lot of stuff about child sex abuse. I mean, that goes on, but of course not all elite linked. You know, it's just what it is.
What I'm saying is this international mafia crime of child trafficking. Nobody really seems to be addressing it.
Interestingly enough, I read on South Front this week, they've migrated, and I was looking at their stuff. There is a Nigerian nightclub owner in Kiev, and in June this year, guess who popped up visiting Kiev? It was Prince Andrew. And he's saying on YouTube that when Prince Andrew went to his nightclub, they brought with him 2 teenage kids, one 12, one 13. He was left alone with them, and when he came back, they were crying and upset and in a state of undress. And then they disappeared with Prince Andrew, and now these children have disappeared from the Ukraine. Now, the Ukrainian mafia have been trafficking young Ukrainians to Western oligarchs for years and years and years and years and years. I mean, the dogs in the street know it. But does the average punter in the Midwest know this? Well, no, it's obviously, this is a very emotive subject, and therefore people can be, do you remember years ago in Portsmouth where a paediatrician had opened their office and it was trashed by a rampant mob of people because they thought that a paediatrician was a paedophile. And the press is full of all this stuff about paedophilia all the time. But at the same time, it's totally inaccurate stuff about paedophilia. The most likely person to abuse a child is somebody they know, somebody in authority over them in school, or more likely in a family. Now, you do get kids trafficked across the world. Lots and lots of middle-class couples in the West adopt kids. But whether they've adopted them in an honourable way is another question, isn't it?
What about all these unaccompanied minors that have been arriving across the Channel? And then there was a scandal, wasn't there, 3 or 4 months ago, where something like 40 or 50 of them had just simply disappeared.
Well, the world economy is breaking down, social structures are being destroyed everywhere, and the mafia are very real. They do exist. They deal drugs, they murder people, they sell things like organs. There's a load of organ trafficking going on in the Ukraine. All these dead guys, they're stripping out their kidneys and so on and selling them. And the Ukraine is probably one of the most mafia states in the world. But that's not what this is about, is it? It's about Colombia. I'm not saying the film is a legitimate film. It's obviously going to get a big audience.
I hope so, yeah.
Well, yeah.
I mean, the thing is, Martin,
but at the same time, there's also an element of the film itself is an exploitation of the situation. They're making money out of this.
Okay, so you say it's going to get a big audience, but I was looking around. I think it's only the Orpheus in Henleys in Bristol which is showing it. Most of the cinemas are not showing it at all. So it's immediately being pushed to the margins. I mean, I think if we look at the history of the cinema, you had in the UK the major British filmmakers like Rank, for example, used to own their own cinemas. What started to happen was the American money started coming in, buying up things like the Odeon networks, etc., and they just refused to show the British-made films. So that meant that the income for the studios was going right down. Less British films were being made. And slowly but surely, money seems to have destroyed, in a way rather like football, totally destroyed the creative energy that there was back in the post-war film industry.
Well, this is capitalism, Tony. It's conglomeration. That's what it does. It's about making money, and you either, and if you can't beat them, join them, and they're going to crush you if you don't play the game their way.
Okay,
this has become controversial in the US because the Trumpites like the film, and the Bidenites think that they don't like it because they think it's sensationalist and all the rest of it. I'm neutral. I do not know what I think of it, but you can hear from the trailer that it's with the US national anthem being sung by children, that there is a bit of an agenda there, isn't there? Let's face it. This isn't a documentary.
The agenda is that what on earth is going on in this country where people are, singing the national anthem whilst these kids are being trafficked? Surely that's the. I mean, I don't think
you'd have to watch the film to draw that aesthetic conclusion.
It sounds strange to me that the Democrats in the US, the Biden camp, if you want. It might be that, for example, the Kennedy camp in the Democrats are very much behind the film and for it. So what do you make of that?
Well, I'm not going to comment on the film because I haven't seen it. People are taking sides on it, not having seen it. That's all I will say. That's very obvious that's what's happened.
I'm taking sides on the Polanski film as well, even though that has hardly been seen by anybody. Anyway, it's nice to see there's some interesting films around, even if neither of us, Martin or I, have seen them, and we're just sort of spouting off about something that may be worth seeing. But this is what happens with critics, and it's one of the reasons why it seems to me with Polanski particularly, his politics is not what the deep state likes, so they will either ban his films like they did with the Dreyfus film, which never got shown hardly at all, I don't think. And we, by the way, put up with some help from Dave, our sound engineer, an English language subtitled version of it, which I'll link up to on our show pages, thisweek.org.uk, which, if you haven't seen, is a terrific watch. And so I will be hearing from this Dispatches programme, which has been on this week, all about the Easter bombings in Sri Lanka in 2019, after the break.
Struck Romeo, sing the streets a serenade, laying everybody low with a love song that he made. Find the streetlight, steps out of the shade, says something like, "You and me, babe, how about it?" Juliet says, "Hey, it's Romeo, you nearly give me a heart attack." He's underneath the window, she's singing, "Eli, my boyfriend's back. You shouldn't come around here singing up at people like that. Anyway, what you gonna do about it?" Juliet, the dice was loaded from the start, and I bet then you exploded into my heart, and I forget the movie song. When you're gonna realize it was just that the time was wrong, Juliet. Come up on different streets, they both were streets of shame. Both dirty, both mean, yes, and the dream was just the same. And I dreamed your dream for you, and now your dream is real. How can you look at me as if I was just another one of your deals? When you can fall for chains of silver, you can fall for chains of gold, you can fall for pretty strangers, and the promises they hold. You promised me everything, you promised me thick and thin, yeah. Now you just say, "Oh, Romeo, yeah. You know, I used to have a scene with him." Juliet, when we made love, you used to cry. You said, "I love you like the stars above. I love you till I die. There's a place for us." You know the movie song. When you're gonna realize it was just that the time was wrong, Juliet. Can't do the talks like the talk on the TV, and I can't do a love song like the way it's meant to be. I can't do everything, but I'll do anything for you. I can't do do anything except be in love with you. And all I do is miss you, and the way we used to be. All I do is keep the beat, the bad company. And all I do is kiss you through the bars of a rhyme. Julie, I do the stars with you anytime. Now, Juliet, when we made love, you used to cry. I said I love you like the stars above. I love you till I die. And there's a place for us, you know, the movie song. When you gonna realize it was just that the time was wrong, Juliet. Struck Romeo, you sing the streets a serenade, laying everybody low with a love song that he made. Find a convenient street light, steps out of the shade and says something like, you and me, babe, how about it?
Spirits can't be locked down. No. We will not comply or get bossed out. No. Do you want to see the masses get hostile? No. Can't coerce us. No. Do you accept the great reset? We don't want the vaccine. You can keep it. Just a politician. You think I'm an idiot? No. We do not consent. Listen up, stop listening to these experts. They've been paid off building a network, scheming behind the scenes, their agenda is covert. They push propaganda on the networks. COVID-19 is a Trojan horse. I will say it with my chest, I show no remorse. Digitalize everything, monopolize what's yours. Give it to them freely or they will take by force. So yo, gotta keep your eyes on these devils. United we stand, so let's rally up the rebels. Celebs ain't speaking out, they're counting all the shekels. They are selling out, I put it down for the record. Witty, violence, profit cause they're sharks. I don't care about your feelings, I didn't ask. They are all puppets like Fauci, Gates and the Schwab. But who's the puppeteer with his hand up their arse like? We are free spirits, can't be locked down. No. We will not comply or get bossed about. No. Do you want to see the masses get hostile? No. Can't coerce us. No. Do you accept the great reset? We don't want the vaccine, we don't need it. Just a politician, you think I'm an idiot? No. We do not consent. No. We are free spirits, can't be locked down. No. We will not comply or get bossed about. No. Do you want to see the masses get hostile? No. Can't coerce us. No. Do you accept the great reset? We don't want the vaccine, you can keep it. Just a politician, you think I'm an idiot? No. We do not consent. No. Yo, you better know it's 2021 and I get sticky with the flow. I don't need your vax, it's a fact, it can go. You can have my job, be my guest, stick it in your toe. Like it's me from the world, I'll go live on my own. I ain't scared of them, I don't know fear the unknown. I will never give away the power of my soul. And if you got a problem, I don't wanna hear you moan. Cause we do it for the people, do it for the children, do it for the lonely souls stuck in the buildings, do it for the ones who lockdowns have killed them. We say no and trust there are millions. Ain't afraid of death, my soul's immortal. I ain't telling you these lockdowns are unlawful. They try and push you and try to be forceful, but nobody here supports the new normal. We are free spirits, can't be locked down. No. We will not comply or get bossed about. No. Do you want to see the masses get hostile? No. Can't coerce us. No. Do you accept the great reset? We don't want the vaccine, we don't need it. Just a politician, you think I'm an idiot? No. We do not consent. No. We are free spirits, can't be locked down. We will not comply or get bossed out. Do you want to see the masses get hostile? Can't coerce us. Do you accept the great reset? We don't want the vaccine, you can keep it. As a politician, you think I'm an idiot? We do not consent.
Apologies for the sound quality in part one. Thank you, everyone, for pinging us in and saying that there was a problem with me sounding like I was some sort of pixie in a pixie mine most of the show so far, according to some of you. Thanks for feeding back. And Dave and I have been trying to sort out in the break there a little bit of a better sound. I hope that's a bit more audible. So anyway, that was Nate Cyclonius. We Say No. Before that, well, you don't need to be a genius to work that out. Dire Straits from 1980. Back when decent music was being produced. I'd love to hear if you've got any modern stuff like the Nate Cyclonius we heard there. Do please send it in to me. I find it very difficult to locate decent music nowadays. I'm sure the youngsters are sort of passing it all around. There is some stuff out there, and I would love to play more of it on here, really, but it's not all that easy to locate. So anyway, welcome back to Not the BCFM Politics Show with Irish Republican Labour activist Martin Summers and me, Tony Gosling. We'll start, as we often do, part two with a bit of an ode by Patrizia Opulenza. Apparently I may have failed to credit her with the poem last week, but you can kind of tell her poems nowadays, your regular listeners. So this one is to the globalist cabal. The globalist cabal sit on devil's board, scream, the world is melting, a horrid horde. Front-facing demons without discourse, climate change without recourse to the truth. Yet, facts we know, another scam is now on show. These demons pushing another lie, their puppets paid to say, aye, aye, no question asked. Whoever bleats on CO2 and carbon streets, ULEZ baloney, another tax to fleece the public and lyrical wax. On platforms shaking with the lies, putrid liars that never hide, no questions asked of idiot views. MSM truth will never choose. The convid changed before our eyes. The fear now pushed is, we will fry. No word on HARP or what they do. Arson and matches, this fact is true. Charlie King on Hawaii, ham, broken-hearted. What a sham. Living it large for all to see. Sausage fingers on board is he. What deal was done so he could stay as long as he pipes us to say climate change, blah, blah, boo-hoo, while pushing GMO. Yes, it's true. No word of this we ever hear. Charlie boy, so insincere. These devils now must all be caught. For all their lies, their souls are bought. Keep sharing truth, dear listeners, do. Our words are seed. To sow, 'tis true. Thank you very much, Patrizia. Another gorgeous little poem there for us. Thank you ever so much. And Martin, what we'll do is we'll start off with this. I don't know, did you see this Dispatches, or have you read anything about the Dispatches programme?
No, I haven't.
Because they did deal this week with those bombings. I mean, maybe you could just reprise on some of your understanding of what happened in 2019 in Easter in Sri Lanka. 250 people were killed in churches where bombs were just blown up in the churches a little bit before there was going to be a presidential election in, or I think it was not a presidential election, sorry, a general election in Sri Lanka.
Well, I was on RT at the time commenting about it, and obviously they've had a real, there's been a real battle in Sri Lanka itself between the Tamil Tigers and the central government, in which both sides carried out horrendous atrocities. So there's no, there's the place is inured to suffering in many respects because they've had such a lot of it. I understand from what you said earlier that the Channel 4 film is pointing the finger at the Sri Lankan government for doing this in relation to the general election coming up. To my mind, I saw it more as a destabilisation of Sri Lanka by outside forces, because the Sri Lankans were they're a swing state between China and the West. So the West has got a lot of fingers in that pie to make sure that they don't line up in the Chinese on the Chinese side. Now, I've got no evidence that they were involved. I'm just talking about motives here, and and of course it was groups linked to the Saudis who were behind it, as I understood at the time. But obviously, I haven't got a computer in front of me, and I haven't got all the details.
No. So this is a sort of thing. I mean, again, we've studied and looked very closely, haven't we, at for example, the 7/7 London bombings, which these are political attacks, it seems to me, that are designed to steer policy in a certain direction. When it was in the run-up to the 2017 general election, we had three terrorist attacks in a line, didn't we, just before the general election here in the UK. So my point really is that Channel 4 are looking at this, but they're not really looking at what's going on under their noses.
Well, that's right, because they probably feel, even if they wanted to investigate the sort of things you're talking about, like 7/7, they wouldn't be allowed to go near it, and it would have all sorts of consequences. Whereas, of course, if you accuse the government of Sri Lanka on the other side of the world of doing these things, it's the sort of thing that sounds as if it's fearless journalism and so on and so forth. What I suspect is that there was an outside hand in this, that it wasn't just a Sri Lankan struggle. Don't forget, there's hardly any Christians in Sri Lanka. There must be the smallest community. There are Muslims, but they're relatively small. Most people are Buddhists, and they're the ones who support the central government, and the Tamil Tigers, by and large, were Hindu. So, it seems perverse for an Islamist group to attack Christians in Sri Lanka. But it probably did have implications for the elections coming up in Sri Lanka, but it's not necessarily just... it's quite possible, for example, that the Israelis had a hand in 7/7. We know that they definitely had a warning via the embassy. So it's interesting that Channel 4 are prepared to look into what you might call false flag terrorism and to treat it seriously. That is, in the past they wouldn't have done that. So something has changed. But whether they've got it right in this particular case, I haven't seen the film, so to comment properly, I need to see it.
We're going to hear now a bit from it. I did try to download it the other day, and it didn't seem to want to download. Normally they will. Anyway, it was released yesterday on YouTube, obviously on Channel 4. I think it was Tuesday this week Tuesday that it was shown. So it's a Channel 4 Dispatches documentary. The title is Sri Lanka's Easter bombings, and we're going to hear now Sri Lanka bombings where 269 people were killed for political power from Dispatches. Let's have a listen to the trailer now.
On Easter Sunday 2019, 6 suicide bombs exploded almost simultaneously across Sri Lanka. The bombers struck 3 churches and 3 luxury hotels, killing 269 people, including 8 British tourists. Naranjali Yasawardena lost her husband and 2 daughters in the bombings. Now, a Channel 4 Dispatches investigation reveals startling allegations and testimony from high-placed whistleblowers who accuse senior Sri Lankan officials of being complicit in the 2019 attacks.
I knew the truth. Who's culprit? Who's main organized? Who's order?
The whistleblowers also accuse individuals in government and military intelligence of thwarting police investigations into the bombings.
Easter Sunday attacking passer.
The allegation is that a plan was hatched to create chaos and fear in order to bring back to power Mahinda and Gotabaya Rajapaksa, 2 brothers who had ruled Sri Lanka for a decade but had been ousted from power a few years before. The attacks were carried out by a local Muslim extremist group, the NTJ, who were inspired by ISIS and were accused of acting alone. Now, 4 years on, Sri Lankan MPs, a parliamentary report and the head of Sri Lanka's Catholic Church are all publicly questioning the official account and claiming government officials and politicians were also behind the attacks.
You have many such involvements of the top leadership in Sri Lanka who were in a grand plot in order to gain power.
This is Hamzia Azad Maulana. Maulana has been interviewed by UN investigators and European intelligence agencies. This is the first time he has told his story publicly. He says that in 2018 he arranged a meeting between the NTJ terrorist cell who carried out the bombings and Suresh Sali, a former head of military intelligence.
They come a white way. 6 people get down from the vehicle. So I introduced Suresh Sali to them.
Maulana says he was asked to wait outside.
So meeting finished and Suresh Sali told me, Rajapaksa need an unsafe situation in Sri Lanka. That's only the way to Gotabaya become president. So this is the meeting between them, with the terrorist group and Suresh Sali.
Mahinda Rajapaksa had ruled Sri Lanka from 2005 to 2015, with his brother Gotabaya Rajapaksa, his defence secretary. After they lost the 2015 election, the new government investigated the Rajapaksas for multiple alleged crimes, including human rights abuses, corruption and murder of journalists and political opponents. Just days after the Easter bombings, Gotabaya Rajapaksa announced he would run for president on a security ticket.
Whoever we speak to across the country asks us to protect the security of the country.
Another high-placed whistleblower told dispatches that the Rajapaksa government subsequently derailed the official investigations into the Easter bombings. We put these allegations to Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who was elected president of Sri Lanka in 2019 and resigned in 2022 following an economic crisis. He did not respond. Suresh Sali denies any involvement with the Easter bombings. He says he never met with NTJ members and said he was in Malaysia at the time of the alleged meeting. The whistleblower's testimonies raise serious questions. Did a senior intelligence official meet covertly with Islamic extremists before they committed the biggest terrorist attack in Sri Lanka's history? Did military intelligence mislead the police in their attempts to apprehend the terrorist group? And did Gotabaya Rajapaksa's government sabotage investigations into the bombings? In the absence of any independent investigation, these questions remain unanswered.
Well, before we get into the meat of this, that's the trailer for, and I think the Channel 4 News report from that dispatches programme on Tuesday this week about the 2019 bombings in Sri Lanka, which killed 260 or so churchgoers. The context of this is, Martin, the Rajapaksas have been hoofed out, haven't they, due to economic reasons, because the country's currency lost loads of its value. But this seems to have been their attempt to remain in power back in 2019. A man interviewed in the Channel 4 video released on Tuesday said he arranged a meeting between the local ISIS-inspired group and a top state intelligence official to hatch a plot to create insecurity in Sri Lanka and enable Gotabaya Rajapaksa to win the presidential election later that year. I mean, this is state terrorism at its absolute worst, and one does wonder if this has actually become one of the normal tactics for people to retain power by saying, oh, we'll be the strong guy, we'll be the tough guy, don't worry, vote for us and we'll stop the terrorists. But they're actually responsible for the terrorism themselves.
Well, I think we can say that it has become the norm for intelligence services to do this. And therefore these allegations are entirely credible. And don't forget that, the civil war in Sri Lanka was extremely brutal. A lot more than 200 and 300 people died. We're talking about tens of thousands of people. And a lot of that involved false flag terrorism of one kind and another. So it's actually, it's definitely in the playbook in Sri Lanka, as it is in many countries. And of course, those who were behind it in Sri Lanka, if it was an entirely homegrown phenomenon, will know of things like, 9/11 and all the rest. If the Americans can do it and it's good enough for them, why isn't it good enough for us? But I don't. I mean, obviously, it's good that Channel 4 have produced this film. And as Krishnan Gurumurthy, I think it says at the end, the questions are open. Because I suspect there was more than just a Sri Lankan connection to these attacks.
Yeah, well, I would agree.
That would be my hunch.
There must be, because as we know, it's not just a copper's hunch, is it? We know that ISIS and ISIL was very, very much involved due to the work of people like Dilyana Katasheva, making sure that many of the flights coming to arms to ISIS in Syria were coming courtesy of the United States of America, and actually with false end-use certificates that Dilyana Katasheva uncovered in her trips into Syria. So it's hardly surprising. It seems to me what's going on here is Rajapaksa's security people are having a chat with people who are working for Western intelligence services like NATO.
It's quite possible, Tony. I totally agree, but you can't be too sure exactly what's going on. It's a very murky world. I think
we should always be very suspicious of anybody that stands on an anti-terrorist platform.
In a way. That's right. That's right. I mean, it's become a standard playbook tactic. Yeah. So in Nigeria, when Babangida was trying to get elected to the presidency some years ago, Sven Hughes contacted me. I think you were in Russia at the time. Sven Hughes contacted me and said, "Well, I've got evidence from an English Anglican priest who's been over here for years, involved in reconciliation work and in hostage release negotiations, that Babangida had contacts with Boko Haram, who kidnapped a load of girls." And at the same time, his pitch to the electorate was, as a Muslim and a general, and I used to be the dictator of this country, I can deal with Boko Haram, vote for me. But the evidence that Sven Hughes had uncovered was that, in actual fact, he was in cahoots with Boko Haram. And this is the way it works. I mean, Al-Qaeda was created by Western intelligence services. If you actually force people to confront this, Tony Blair, whoever, no, Al-Qaeda was created by MI6 with the CIA and the French intelligence services. They created it with the Saudis.
Operation Cyclone.
That's right. So what we're supposed to believe, we've got the 9/11 weekend coming up. What we're supposed to believe about that is we created Al-Qaeda to the extent of arming them and training them and showing them how to blow things up. Our special forces showed them how to blow things up, showed them how to kill people. As long as they were just killing Soviet soldiers in Afghanistan, that was supposedly all right. And then, of course, we lost track of it, and then they've started to attack us. They've gone rogue. Nobody in the Russian, Chinese or Iranian general staffs believes that Al-Qaeda or ISIS are rogue organisations. They see them as glove puppet organisations for the Western intelligence services, because they are. They were in the first place. I mean, nobody can deny that. They still are now, although most people don't realise this.
It's quite feasible that Western intelligence glove puppets killed those 269 people in those churches in 2019.
Yeah, well, the stuff I was reading at the time, which I was using with RT, was that the group, the so-called homegrown group, was funded by the Saudis. And the Saudis, of course, are our allies. The Russians aren't our allies. We're at war with them, but the Saudis are.
I'll put links up to the video. I think you have to sign into YouTube, rather boringly, and state your age before you're allowed to see that, because there are some disturbing images in there. Of course, there are loads of disturbing images out there. So that you have to do if you want to watch the full Dispatches film. And I think you can watch it on the Dispatches website too, but it's definitely worth... but I mean, at the end of the day, Martin, it's okay for Channel 4 to do this film about, Sri Lanka. They may do it about Boko Haram. Who knows one day? Maybe they have already. But the real nub of the issue is what goes on in British terrorist attacks. And as I mentioned, you've got the 7/7 London bombings, which we've done quite a lot of work in over the years, looking at the Israeli involvement in that Netanyahu got a warning that morning, nobody else did. And he says he passed it on to Scotland Yard. Scotland Yard then denied that. And so the Israeli embassy knew something was coming. How did they know? We also had this Israeli firm, Variant Systems, who had got a military people running it, who were given access 6 months before the bombing attack to the tube tunnels. They were doing work on CCTV cameras, and so they most definitely had access, these ex-Israeli military people, to it. The agenda being, of course, to make the terror real, bring so-called Islamic terror. And one of the most amazing things that I found in 7/7 was this conversation I had with Mark Honningsbaum at The Guardian. I mean, he published a podcast on the day of the attacks, because he'd been sitting with people who'd just come out of the Edgware Road tube bomb in 2005 at Marks and Spencer's, and he did a quick report for the Guardian website. Anyway, the next day's paper, it completely changed his story in the next day's paper. In the podcast, he said twice that the bombs were underneath the trains. This is what the people had been telling him. And then in the next day's paper comes a Guardian article saying the bombs are inside the train. So I contacted Mark directly, phoned Mark up, didn't record him or anything. All you've got is my word to go on that. And I spoke to him. I said, well, why this discrepancy? How come on the day of the bombings you're reporting a podcast, which is still out there in various places, I'm sure you can find it somewhere, where he says twice the bombs are inside the trains, the bombs are inside the trains. And then in the next day's paper, you publish an article in the paper which says they're under the trains, and then you say in the next day's paper they're inside the trains, which, was the beginning of this story of the suicide bombers were in the trains, blah, blah. Obviously, it's a very messy scene and very difficult to work out if it was under or inside, especially as the whole of the floor of the train is blown up. Anyway, so he paused for about 10 seconds before he answered, and he said to me, not everything I submit as copy ends up in the next day's paper, Tony. So there you have it. So the whole agenda of something like that is steered, the discussion, by the way that the mass media, the mainstream media in London report these things. So that's 7/7. Moving on to the 2017 general election here in Britain, we had 3 terrorist attacks. We had the Westminster Bridge, where a guy drove his 4x4 into the gates of Parliament on Westminster Bridge, so-called terrorist attack. I'm not sure if he was killed anyway. And then there was the attack at London Bridge with people running around with knives trying to kill people, apparently Islamic maniacs. No one really knows why they did it. And then we had the horrific Manchester Arena bombing. All this within the 3 weeks or so running up to the 2017 general election, Martin. It seems a bit strange. And then all of those 3 so-called attackers, ringleaders of those attacks, had been reported to the MI5 anti-terrorist hotline. And so one does wonder, I mean, this is the way these things work. We had literally 3 or 4 days before that general election in 2017 that was called a snap election, called by Theresa May. We had a thing with Jeremy Corbyn being put on TV, and loads of pictures saying, oh, look, here he is chatting with these various terrorists. I think it was a Palestinian terrorist he was supposed to be chatting with. And so it seemed to me obvious that what had happened was, whether these were coincidence or just simply planned, like apparently the Sri Lankan attacks were planned for political purposes, then suddenly we have a news story saying Jeremy Corbyn is obviously a terrorist, literally 2 or 3 days before that general election, which steers a lot of the debate and discussion, and obviously will put many, many millions potentially of people off from voting for Jeremy, Martin.
Well, that's right. The same thing happened in the 2003, I think it's 2003 Madrid train bombings, all directed at socialist voting suburbs around Madrid, because the majority of the Spanish population did not want to go to war in Iraq. They were absolutely opposed to it. They were disgusted that Aznar had dragged them into it. I think we've got to presume that virtually all of these attacks which have been going on, Islamist attacks over the last 20 or 30 years, virtually all of them are orchestrated by the intelligence services. There are some random ones, because they've created a sort of disaffected Muslim youth who are watching all of their fellow religionists being massacred from Apache helicopters and so on. But that just creates a kind of pool from which they can recruit for these false flag attacks. Now, it used to be just me and you going on about this sort of thing on a minor radio show. But, of course, the problem they've got now is that the Russians, the Chinese and the Iranians, they know more than we know, Tony. And that's the problem they've got. And out there, when I was in Colombia in 2005, I was talking to people about 9/11 and saying, well, we think that the Americans did it. And they just went, claro, it's just obvious. Lots of people in the world do not see us the way we see ourselves. Well, people are living in a controlled bubble. It's a virtual reality bubble in which they live. And you know, nobody doubts that the British intelligence services are there to protect us, aren't they? Well, you have to watch the latest in West Belfast, there's probably a bit more of a sceptical opinion.
Watch the latest James Bond film. That will reassure you about the role of the British intelligence.
That's right. And when you were talking about Hollingsbourne earlier, it'll be the sub-editors in The Guardian who are working for MI5 who say, no, you can't say that.
You probably get a clearer picture in the Johnny English films, I think, about how the British intelligence operates. But anyway, there's also the way the Anglo-Zionist Empire seems to have weaponised the whole idea of terrorism, now also declaring the Wagner Group, for example, a terrorist organisation. Well, really, is it a terrorist organisation? It's a Russian-based private military company. There's all sorts of uses of this expression terrorism, aren't there now? For example, many would isn't it the Iranian Revolutionary Guard are now supposed to be a terrorist organisation? Well, actually, really, it's a fighting unit of an enemy country. It's hardly can be classed as a terrorist organisation. What they're trying to do, I suppose, is to say that these organisations are rather like these Western terrorist organisations, that they're going around blowing up civilians and this sort of thing. But what do you make of the weaponisation of this term and the banning of various, what many would see as, legitimate groups as terrorist groups now?
Well, back in the day, Sinn Féin used to refer to the British government political wing of the British Army. And, of course, it was tongue-in-cheek, but it's not far from the truth. A terrorist is somebody who's killing people that you don't agree with. When we kill people, that's not terrorism. That's legitimate use of military force.
Yeah. Well,
that I'm afraid is universal. The people you don't like are the terrorists. But of course, what we're talking about here specifically is false flag terrorism, and that is it's always been there, but it's become a curse. Because it's everywhere now, and of course everybody's copying. But once people know what's going on, they all start copying each other's tactics.
What do you make of this religious aspect to what's going on in Sri Lanka? Because it does seem as if there is an attempt also to. I mean, we see similar things going on in India between Hindus and Muslims, particularly, but also Hindus and Christians. The idea is to try and create these kind of sectarian religious battles, sectarian religious wars, to actually spark them off. In other words, to create a massacre against one community, and then the other community is left with very little choice, but they then get organised.
Well, yes. I mean, each of these incidents is specific and detail matters. We can't just generalise about everything. Because,
that's exactly what I'm trying to do with religious
all right. Well, I'm just kind of come to the point about the religious thing. Don't forget that the Islamist terrorists, supposedly, I mean, there might not have been any terrorists as such. The bombs may have been planted and then a claim was made, but they also attacked luxury hotels full of tourists. So they weren't necessarily Christians, they were just foreigners, I suppose. Yes, I mean, in India, it's quite clear that the Modi government has, in fact, I mean, it's, when Modi was in power as Prime Minister of Gujarat, Hindu pilgrims were coming back from some pilgrimage, and then they were supposedly attacked by Muslims, and there was a fire in the train they were in, and lots of them died, and that then led to a pogrom against the Muslims in Gujarat, in which thousands died, in which the police did nothing to protect them. But subsequent investigations showed that the fire was actually inside the train. And that right-wing extremists, the RSS probably in the Indian case, had killed their own co-religionists in order to start a pogrom against the Muslims. Now, it sounds wicked, but it's also very effective. The Hindu population, if they had known that it was their own militants that had killed those people, might have thought twice. But of course they didn't think that. They were encouraged to take a militant attitude that they're attacking us, so we're going to attack them. And that is false flag terrorism, using religion as a means of creating the necessary divisions. And this has been going on for a long time. I mean, the research and analysis wing of the Indian Army isn't part of NATO, but they're also part of the mindset of NATO, and that's the sort of things they might do.
A similar mindset. Well, let's wind this section up by looking at some domestic so-called terrorism. There's been a big scare this week as a chappie called Daniel Abed Khalifa, a British Army soldier, has managed to escape from Wandsworth Prison. What do you make of this? It seems amazing that someone who is really about to be prosecuted under the Official Secrets Act, trained killer, who apparently, although I have my doubts, this guy is really dangerous, and he could kill at any time and anywhere. Yet Julian Assange, who is actually not at all dangerous, he's an editor of one of the greatest newspapers that's ever existed on the internet, called WikiLeaks. He's being kept in the high security Belmarsh, so it seems a little bit topsy-turvy, doesn't it?
Well, it certainly does, doesn't it, just on the face of it. Don't forget, this guy is also a British soldier, and therefore he possibly joined the British Army to get the relevant skills. And, you'd have to say, if we were watching The Great Escape, it's rather enterprising of him to get out, escape under a food delivery lorry.
Do you think he could have done it on his own, or do you think he may have had help?
Well, I don't know, Tony, is the answer to that. I just don't know. And it's not, we can speculate, but it's just speculation, isn't it? A lot of what we hear about all of this is, there's more going on than meets the eye, but we don't know what the more is. Most of the Islamist groups in Britain have been heavily infiltrated by the intelligence services and manipulated by them.
The point I'm trying to make here is, and the police have said they want to reassure the public that they have no information which indicates nor any reason to believe that Khalifa poses a threat to the wider public. But our advice, if you do see him, is not to approach him and call 999 straight away. Well, isn't this mad? Because do they think that Julian Assange poses a threat to the wider public?
Well, Julian Assange poses a threat to the hegemony of the powerful, and that's much more important than the wider public. Come on, Tony, get your priorities right.
Listen, you might get a job at the BBC. You carry on like that. Look, there has also been a big development with Julian this week, which is this group of Australian MPs heading over to the United States very soon in order to lobby. At least what's been going on in Australia is quite interesting. Over the years, the main political parties and the powerful forces in there, which are largely pro-US, have been pushing back against the members of Parliament and the civil society in Australia, which has been trying to do something to deliberately lobby to get Julian released and allowed to return to Australia. Maybe even possibly to face justice there if there's any justice to face, and then or else maybe perhaps just carry on running his newspaper, which is what he used to do for a living. So what do you make of this move of the Australian MPs finally to be making a cross-party group over to the US?
Well, it's to be welcomed, obviously, but I've got I doubt they're going to get anywhere. Public opinion in Australia is pretty clear that they want Assange released and brought back to Australia. The National Party...
It's 80%.
Yeah, the National Party, because there's so much in the pocket of the Americans and the British, they're opposed to it. The Labour Party, which ought to see this as a core issue for them, they are having their arms twisted up their back by the Americans at the moment. The Murdoch press is very powerful in Australia. It really does determine the agenda for a lot of what goes on. And the mainstream government, although they raise Assange's issue with the Americans just laugh in their faces and say, we're not doing that. And they go, all right then. And of course they've just signed up to this AUKUS pact with us and the Americans, which is, as Paul Keating has pointed out, the former Prime Minister of Australia, must be the worst deal ever. We are just going to pay millions and millions of Aussie dollars that we haven't got, so that we can pretend to have our own nuclear submarines, which are actually just going to be provided by the Americans and staffed by the Americans, so that we can provoke a war with China, who are our main trading partner, which is what pays our bills. And of course, all of this build-up in the South China Sea by the West isn't to stop the Chinese stopping people going through the South China Sea. Most of the ships going through the South China Sea are going to and from China. What we are preparing to do is blockade China. Yeah? So that ships can't go in and out. We can't do much about China as such, but we can blockade the coast. And that's a big vulnerability for China, because they're very dependent on that international trade. But it's, if the Chinese were saying we're just defending ourselves by having a huge fleet based in the North Atlantic just to make sure that the channel remains a free passageway for our container ships, would we accept that as legitimate? The answer is we wouldn't.
Well, I mean, I know you're always having a pop at Murdoch, but he's, I think, done a very good job during the pandemic, actually getting out this information about Eco Health Alliance.
That's Tucker Carlson, not Murdoch.
Well, yes, it was the Murdoch empire over there, actually.
Yes, I know, but Tucker Carlson was working for Murdoch, and at that time he did come out with stuff that might be useful. But of course, he's paid the price. He's not paying the price Julian Assange has paid, is he?
Well, outing Eco Health Alliance, it wasn't just Tucker Carlson. It was done on the Fox network, which is Murdoch's. And also, it was Steve Hilton, so Murdoch was clearly behind that. Maybe he's becoming an old man and thinking, well, actually, let's do a bit of real news for a change. But he's actually been quite supportive over in Australia. The latest items is talking about how Julian, he definitely gives voice to the family of Julian Assange. His brother is saying, who's been on our show, by the way, that WikiLeaks founder could return to Australia as a US ambassador hints at a plea deal. So this could be the deal which these Australian MPs are going to broker over. So it might be that Julian pleads guilty to something, and in exchange he's allowed to return to Australia. So that would be quite interesting. Apparently, according to the Murdoch press in Sky News Australia, the United States is looking for an off-ramp to avoid prosecuting Julian Assange.
Well, I mean, if I was them, I'd be looking for an off-ramp because it's become an embarrassment. But on the other hand, if they're seen to back down over something like this without Julian Assange showing sufficient kind of submission, then they won't be happy with that. And obviously they should have released him years ago. I mean, this whole thing's a farrago of nonsense from the start, isn't it? I mean, it's not been very good for him. It's been very bad for him and his family, but it's been very good for educating the rest of the world about what really goes on. As I was saying to you earlier, the rest of the world doesn't see us the way we see ourselves. The glorious Americans and British who are always on the side of freedom and democracy and the truth. That's not how we're perceived at all.
No, it certainly isn't. Have there been any more coups in Africa this week?
No, well, there's the Gabon one we covered last week, which is the latest iteration.
Not this week. Maybe it's going to be Burkina Faso. Oh, hang on, that's already
They're already couped.
Equatorial Guinea next week, or Congo the week after. Do you want to just say something about Congo? You mentioned that last week, didn't you, that there's actually two countries?
Yeah, well, there's the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is massive. It's what used to be Zaire, which is where Patrice Lumumba was the prime minister, or president, probably prime minister. I think he was assassinated by the NATO countries back in the 1960s. There's another there's a French-speaking country called Congo, which is right next to Zaire, but it's between Zaire, what was Zaire, and Guinea-Bissau, I think. No, Equatorial Guinea. So they're both French-speaking colonies. And of course the French-speaking colonies are the ones in Africa which are up in arms, because the French basically, they kind of gave these colonies independence in the 60s, but they very much continued to control what went on there, not least, for example, by controlling their currency. They've got to use the franc. Even though the French themselves have given up using it, they've got to use it, and they've got to keep all their reserves in the Banque de France.
So is this wave of coups, many of whom allegedly anyway carried out by the Wagner private military company, do you think this is related to Ukraine?
Well, the Wagner people were not behind any of these coups. They are brought in as a private military company by African governments to help them fight Islamist terrorists, because they don't trust the West to come in and fight the Islamist terrorists, because they know that the West actually arms and trains the Islamist terrorists. So one of the things that's happened in Niger this week is there's been a massive, I think it was in Niger, I was hearing earlier, I can't remember, one of these countries, the Islamists are becoming more assertive, at the same time as the West is putting pressure on these governments to allow their troops back in to deal with them. Now, the perception in Africa is that knocking down the Libyan state, which was actually quite positive. I mean, what Libya was trying to do under Gaddafi is approach all these francophone countries in the Sahel and say, look, you're fed up of being told what to do by the French, and they control your currency. Why don't we set up an alternative currency based on the gold dinar, which will be a universal currency for us here in West Africa? And that's just precisely when Gaddafi was overthrown by the British and the French. And of course the Islamist threat in Africa is being hyped up. You know, we were talking about Sri Lanka earlier. The suspicion is that the Islamists are in fact working with Western intelligence services, and then the Western intelligence say, oh look, the fox, so tally-ho, we've got to intervene in Gabon or wherever it is to get rid of the Islamists. The Americans have got a massive base in Niger, which is a big drone base, which tries to survey the whole continent from there. Now, there is a further complication. I don't know if Chossudovsky has been pushing the idea, which I'm not entirely convinced of or not convinced of, that the US secret services are quite happy for these coups to take place as long as it's plausibly deniable, because they're messing the French up. And don't forget, the Americans are in the process of asset stripping the European economy. That's what they're doing. They don't want competition.
Well, you're right. You're quite right. That's certainly what they're up to. We've got an interesting story on anti-war this week, antiwar.com. Justin Raimondo, I think it is, that runs that.
Well, he's dead now, but he set it up.
2 US militias are having a war against each other, US-backed militias in eastern Syria. So a Deir ez-Zor military council leader announced his militia was in a guerrilla war against the Syrian Democratic Forces. Ethnic tensions between Washington's Arab and Kurdish partners in eastern Syria boiled over this week, with analysts warning fighting could escalate. So far, 100 people have been killed in the fighting taking place near American soldiers. An unnamed leader in the military council told Al Jazeera the conflict began with the dominance of Kurdish forces over the region during the war against ISIL. We were promised that the tribesmen, represented by the Deir ez-Zor military council, would eventually regain control. Well, that never happened. That's why a guerrilla war against the SDF eventually began. Some journalists made similar observations. This is an unprecedented escalation between the SDF and Deir ez-Zor residents. This is an indication of the bad policy implemented by the SDF and the wrong calculations by the Americans. So, in a way, I mean, with the American soldiers, inertly stood there watching by, maybe taking an active role in some ways, looking through their binoculars, watching these various groups fighting each other, they'd probably be delighted, Martin.
Well, I think it's very messy. One of the things I was reading was that the Deir ez-Zor military council, mostly Sunnis, and obviously they cooperated to get rid of ISIS with the Americans, but they don't want to be ruled by the Kurds, because the Kurds, in fact, are a tiny minority in Syria. They always were, but they've become quite influential because of their relationship with the PKK and all the international politics that goes on. The Americans have been training and arming them, so but of course that's not necessarily what the locals who are not Kurdish want. And of course there's no justification in international law for US forces to be there at all. And it's possible that the Deir ez-Zor military council have been talking to the Syrian government about we need to, because the Syrian government were also talking to the SDF at one stage, the Kurds, saying, we need to do a deal to get foreigners out of our country. Yeah? Americans, Turks, everybody out. We just want Syrians here. Because in the Idlib pocket, there are thousands and thousands of Uyghur fighters come to liberate Syria. The Syrian war, sadly, isn't over. The sanctions on Syria have been released by all of the other Arab countries, including Saudi Arabia, but the West and Israel continue to sanction mainstream Syria and continue to bomb it. And it's an absolute disgrace what's happened there. horrifying. And of course, the British have continued to put sanctions on Syria because Assad must go, he's got to go. Don't you realise? Assad must go. They're still coming out with the same old stuff. And that's one of the reasons why you've got lots and lots of refugees from Syria, because they can't rebuild. It's quite possible that the Chinese could come in there and rebuild, but they're not allowed to.
Let's go back to Africa anyway, and bizarre news about the US ambassador to Niger. We had a little discussion last week about the French ambassador to Niger being told to leave. Well, apparently now the American ambassador, who only arrived last week, has already been told that she's got to leave. She's got 48 hours. She's just been told today. The new US ambassador to Niger, Kathleen Fitzgibbon, only arrived in the capital, Niamey, earlier this month. Well, it's not long into September, so she's only been there a very short time. So Niger, obviously, these. Are these ambassadors actually leaving? They're being told to leave, but are they going, Martin? Do you know?
Well, as we speak, they haven't gone, either of them, have they? I mean, you'd have thought that if the West is opposed to this coup in Niger, that they would have withdrawn their own ambassadors in protest. But no, they want to keep their claws into the country. And I imagine that the youth in Niamey, the capital, who support the coup, they don't want French soldiers there, they don't want US based there, they don't want any foreigners in our country. And you can see why they might think that, can't you?
Yes, you're right. All the supporters have been calling for the French ambassador and the French troops to leave. Anyway, we're going to have a listen now to Scott Ritter talking about these African coups, our penultimate item. He's looking at in one of his discussions with a German podcast or whatever, video cast of some sort. And he's looking at the Gabon coup, the other coups in Africa, really as the end of this whole idea of neo-colonialism. That is to say, the days after the colonial era, the open colonial era, when European countries ran and managed and took the resources out of these African countries over to the neo-colonialism, where they pretended that they were one step away, but then they allowed, in a kind of Roman Empire style, local people who were their puppets to run those countries. And even that era now appears to be over, according to Scott Ritter.
I think what we're witnessing in Gabon is a continued manifestation of a process of decolonialization in Africa, especially in regards to France. France had extensive colonial interests in Africa. And even when, in the aftermath of the Second World War, France shed its colonies, it didn't really shed the colonies. It just redefined them in a post-colonial reality that many call neo-colonialism. It's basically, in France, they called it France-Afrique. Pardon my French if I didn't say that correct. But the notion was that France would continue to dominate its former colonial territories in Africa by controlling the political, economic, social, and military aspects of that country, up to and including controlling the currency that the countries use. In the case of Gabon, it has been a strategic part of France's overall strategic posture since gaining its independence. Gabon was a source of uranium that made the French independent nuclear force possible. It allowed France to develop a nuclear capability independent of the United States. And interestingly enough, especially given France's current posture vis-a-vis Niger, where France has rejected a military coup that ousted a pro-French president. The current or recently ousted president of Gabon is the son of a man who was put in power in Gabon in a military coup that was backed by the French army, because France has played that sort of role, controlling, the destiny of these, post-colonial assets. And I think Africa is waking up. They're realizing that the continued poverty that grips these nations, whether it be Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, Niger, Gabon, others. These are all nations that are adrift in domestic chaos and poverty, while a political and economic elite thrive. The military, which, while the officers may be an elite, the rank and file are drawn from the people, and therefore the military in some ways is more representative of the genuine will of the people, is tired of sustaining this. And this is why we see successive military coups occurring to oust pro-French political elites. And Gabon is the most recent example of this. This is something that is a existential threat to France. France has extensive economic ties to Africa, and the rapid disintegration of these ties will reverberate into the French economy, and that will have political reverberations because many of the French political elite have gained their wealth because of the continued exploitation of Africa. So there will be consequences. France cannot be expected just to go quietly into that night, but France is not a superpower. While France has limited military capacity in Gabon, it's not sustainable military capacity, meaning that if Gabon, the junta in Gabon decided to forcefully evict France, there's literally nothing France could do, unless the United States was willing to come to its assistance. And I don't see the United States lining up to support the post-colonial policies of France in Africa. We see this in Niger, where France has taken a very militant stance against the military junta there, refusing, for example, to withdraw an ambassador, despite the fact that the junta said the ambassador must leave. The United States has not weighed in on this, nor has the United States weighed in on the potential of military intervention by pro-French African forces that are being constituted as we speak under the umbrella of ECOWAS, the economic cooperation of West African states. I think the future is dire for France. They are going to come face to face with the limits of their power and the rage of Africa, which is headed up to here with French post-colonial policies.
Wir haben es ja bereits angesprochen, erst Mali, Burkina Faso, dann Niger und nun Gabun. Warum erleben wir derzeit eine Reihe von Militärputschen in Afrika? Siehst du einen Zusammenhang etwa mit dem Ukraine-Krieg oder dem Aufstieg der BRICS?
I mean, on the surface, the causal effects of these coups, the breakup of Francafrique is derived from the history of Francafrique, independent of BRICS, independent of Ukraine. It's the consequences of bad policy, stretched out over decades. But, nothing happens in a vacuum. And so the disintegration of confidence in Africa toward France has been accelerated, I believe, by a global trend towards multipolarity that emphasizes the sovereignty of the nation over continued adherence to a singularity. The African model of being subordinated to the French singularity is in many ways paralleled by the global model, where the United States has insisted on global adherence to the rules-based international order that the United States imposed on the world following the end of the Second World War. And the rejection of these models of singularity by much of the world, parallel. So I do see parallel development of the former French colonies rejecting the French singularity, with the rest of the world rejecting the American singularity. And they're linked by the BRICS process. BRICS is a economic forum that emphasizes multipolarity, emphasizes the equality of nations. And I think that we see the maturation of BRICS, which just occurred in South Africa in the recent summit, where BRICS transformed itself from an organization that had potential into an organization that was realizing its potential. The expansion of BRICS and the power that's going to accrue, economic power that's going to accrue collectively, is a transformative moment. I don't think the world has woken up to just how important the South African BRICS summit was. Literally pre-summit, the United States could make a claim that it was and continued to be the world's most influential economic power. Post-BRICS, the United States has been eclipsed by this unified BRICS. It's not just the United States, but the G7 and the entire rules-based international order has been eclipsed by this new multipolarity that's going to dominate the world going forward. So, I just don't think people will. I know in America we haven't woken up to this fact. The fact is, this is a hard thing for Americans to accept. We're no longer number one. We're number two. And what's number one is a Chinese-led BRICS that's acting in concert against the policies of the United States that promote American hegemony over global unity.
Well, fascinating analysis from Scott Ritter there, former US Marine Corps intelligence officer, Iraq, weapons inspector, that resigned honourably before the war started. The Americans, what he's implying there, have been kind of boxed in, slowly but surely, by China.
Well, yes, that is obviously the big picture. The smaller picture, as I suggested earlier, is that the Americans might be quite happy to see the French pushed out of Africa as long as they can take their place. And that many of these coup leaders in West Africa have in fact been trained by the Americans, and they've done their military stuff in West Point and so on. But the bigger picture is clearly that's what's going on. The Western deep state has dominated the post-war period, post-Second World War period on this planet. And of course, for 500 years before that, they've been top dogs in all sorts of different ways. India used to be under British rule, and China was effectively under British rule. We determine the policies. But of course, they're big countries, and they've eventually chucked us out. And of course, they've now developed to the point where they're actually, more dynamic economically than we are, which is not really surprising. As they industrialise, they're going to become more and more powerful. And because we are already industrialised, we've only got one way to go, which is down. And we can either accept this and cooperate to try and make a better world for everybody, or we can fight it tooth and nail. Guess what we're doing?
Well, it's not us, is it? It's our idiotic leaders. And so you're right. I mean, I think there is this sort of sensible, let's trade, let's get on with each other, let's obey international law group, which is slowly but surely coalescing around China. Every time the BRICS meet, there's another bunch of countries that say, yes, we want to be part of this, not part of that. And they're looking to this new system, which is emerging as a system of order, and the other system in the United States is, it seems to me, a system of chaos. Which, and I mean, in a way, what's been going on in Gabon with the French is a little bit like maybe Suez and the Brits, Martin, isn't it?
The what and the Brits?
Suez, the idea of the Americans saying no, we're not coming to help.
The French already had their Suez moment in Algeria, And of course, it still dominates modern French politics because Algeria was officially part of France. And at the end of the war, they'd made such a mess that millions of French speakers had to leave, as the Portuguese settlers had to leave in Africa. And also millions of Muslims who'd fought for the French also had to leave. And that's why these are the people that live in the French inner cities now.
What I'm saying is that the Americans seem to be so powerless in Africa, and maybe even they're not interested because most of the relations are with the European countries.
The Americans are trying to dominate Africa. AFRICOM was set up to dominate Africa.
They're happy that the French are not going to be there because then they have their.
Well, that's right. They've got their own agenda, which is we want to dominate Africa. Never mind the French, get out of the way and let us have a go.
They're also quite clearly using this, trying probably at a diplomatic level to use this sort of thing as diplomatic leverage with the French government themselves, saying, well, look, if you want a bit of help out in Africa, you're going to have to do X, Y, and Z and jump through a few hoops for us first.
Well, that's right. The Western Europe, let's just stick to France. France has, despite the misgivings of many people across the political spectrum in France, have gone all in on going to war with Russia over the Ukraine. De Gaulle would have just said, no, we're not doing that. He was the one who got France out of Algeria as well. But I think he probably would have wanted to carry on exploiting the smaller African countries because, that was in France's interest. So, at the end of the day, that was what de Gaulle was about. So he wouldn't have gone to war in the Ukraine, but he wouldn't necessarily have given up these colonies in Africa.
Difficult to fathom his mind on that one. Anyway, we're going to wind up this week with a bit of a jokey one, which is a sort of joke, but it's not joke. It's about the Maui fires, and I'm not sure of her name. Maybe if your listeners can tell me if you know what her name is. But this woman has done I think, quite excellent, American woman has done quite an excellent little summary of what was going on with the Maui fires in Hawaii, because we saw a lot of stuff on the mainstream press, it's terrible, making out this is just some kind of natural event. Well, quite clearly, as we saw in the Greek fires, a lot of these fires were set deliberately. There was also an enormous amount of protection for some of the properties of the rich and powerful, the Amazon, Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and various other, Oprah Winfrey, who had their pads. They didn't seem to be touched. And one of the most amazing things was the police chief for Maui was the same guy who was in charge during the attack, the massacre in Las Vegas a few years ago, the police guy, and they didn't sound the alarms, which many people were very annoyed about. Anyway, so here she goes, and we'll let her say what she thinks was really going on. Of course, no conspiracy at all with the Maui fires.
So it's just a coincidence that the police chief was the same man in charge of the Las Vegas shooting. And it's just a huge coincidence that property owned by millionaires and billionaires like Jeff Bezos, Oprah, and the founder of PayPal remained untouched, while the land of the natives burned only a few feet away, literally. And it's just a huge coincidence that the island had the largest system of outdoor sirens in the world, yet they decided not to sound them or alert anybody in any way. And it's just a huge coincidence that they closed all of the schools, sent all of the children home, and turned off the water as soon as the fires started so that people couldn't put them out. And it's just a coincidence that under orders, policemen blockaded the exits, didn't allow anyone to evacuate, and forced them to jump in the water to save their own lives. And it's just a coincidence that the island is set to be the very first to operate on 100% renewable energy. And to do so, they must significantly decrease their CO2 emissions. And it's just a huge coincidence that 1 month prior to the fires, the mayor issued a press release highlighting his commitment to the United Nations 2030 Agenda of Sustainable Development. And it's just a coincidence that Hawaii is the only state to have submitted a voluntary local review, which is a framework and goal set to achieve sustainable development. And it's just a huge coincidence that BlackRock and the United States government are 2 out of the 3 largest landowners on the island who have been trying to buy up the land from the natives for the past few decades, who refuse to sell, and both of them are part of the renewable energy agenda. And it's just a huge coincidence that the survivors' homes that are still standing are now being evicted. And it's just a coincidence that the fact checkers saying that all of this is a coincidence are owned by BlackRock. At this point, if you believe that all of these are coincidences, you are the crazy one, not me. Google is not going to come out and tell you what's going on, and even if they did, a lot of you wouldn't even believe it unless it was from a government or fact-checking website. But guess what? They're not going to tattle on themselves, so you need to think for yourself. We should be absolutely enraged about these fires. We really need to stand up and do something, because things like this are just going to keep happening because we allow them.
Well, it's a shame she doesn't actually say who she is, but anyway, well done, girl. And even if some of those are a little bit exaggerated, like I think apparently the water was cut off because of, not necessarily switched off, but cut off because of the fires. But anyway, at least some of those being coincidences, well, some are not. Time to sign off now. Thanks to our guest, Irish Republican Labour activist Martin Summers, and also to sound engineer Dave Bazanko. Download our MP3s to listen in the car or anywhere you like. Do please send us interviews and story tips via Not the BCFM Politics show page, which has got our email addresses on it. You can find there the podcasts, the full-length interviews, story links, the comment page, and our email addresses. And you can subscribe to my weekly email list at thisweek.org.uk. We've been streaming live from the People's Republic of Stokes Croft in Bristol on the talkradio.org.uk stream at radioquk.com in Camberley, Surrey, and live on the Not the BCFM Politics Show app. If you can restream us live or rebroadcast, just let me know and I'll credit you here. Have a relaxing, please, and enjoyable weekend. Do please join us for Not the BCFM Politics Show at 5 o'clock next Friday. God bless. And don't let the satanic banksters get you down.
There's a million reasons why I don't believe it. There's a million reasons why it can't be true. Open fire can't melt steel. It's not hot enough. It's nothing new, it's not a mystery. Check out the Reichstag, Germany. There's a million questions still. Seven still remain alive. It's nothing new, it's not a mystery. Check out the USS Liberty. 9/11, 9/11. What went down with Building 7? It's a mystery to this day. The building fell with such precision. Free fall speed, no reasons given. Like the towers, it just fell. The fire's not enough. No way hard enough to bring it down. The project for the new American century was added to a year before that day. It states in order to proceed a modern day Pearl Harbor it would need. The comfort talking to the bank. 9/11 set them free. The project for the new American century. Cold War burned through WMD. 9/11, 9/11. What went down with Building 7? It's a mystery to this day.
He was in agony when he prayed in Gethsemane. For the price it was to pay seemed too much for him. He contemplated the price to be paid for humanity. And even the Almighty turned his back at him. They used to love to stay with the master, but now they consider him a disaster. The ones who cried, Hosanna, Hosanna, same ones who led him straight to Golgotha. Judas was too quick to betray him. Peter couldn't wait to deny him. The world at large will reject him. Tell me what you want to do to him. But why didn't the Jews know he's the King of Kings? When even the stars and the kings know he's the King of Kings. The sun and the moon was his authority, because he told them once and they be standing still. They hung him high, stretched him wide. He hung his head and then he died. But that's not how the story ends. On the third day he rose again.
Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Oh yes, oh yes. Hallelujah, he arose. Oh yes, oh yes. Hallelujah, he arose. The Prince of Peace arose. Hallelujah, he arose. Oh yes, oh yes. Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Oh yes, oh yes. Hallelujah, he arose.
Sunday morning, he was still in the tomb on the Sunday morning. Death had him in his womb on the Sunday morning.
Mary was weeping, the gods were watching.
Why do you seek for the living amongst the dead? Though he died like a lamb, but he's still not dead. Cause even in the grave, he's not over death. Now we have the victory over death. I see an angel of the Lord come down from heaven. He rode us to the world like a little pebble. Who is the King of glory? The Lord God strong and mighty. Where is that victory? Where is that sting? Every stone has been rolled away.
He's no longer in the grave.
They hung him high, stretched him wide. He hung his head and then he died. But that's not how the story ends. On the third day he rose again.
Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Oh yes, oh yes. Hallelujah, he arose.
When the sun refused to shine upon this awful scene, and humanity has lost hope because all they saw was the cross and his bleeding victim. Their future seemed to be darkened with despair as they watched him laid in the tomb, hands folded on his breast, his eyes shut and his lips seeming forever silent. They watched as a heavy stone was rolled against the entrance of the tomb, and a guard of 100 soldiers around the sepulchre. Permit me to say, Jesus was very dead, but that was not how the story ended. For 3 days later, early Sunday morning, there was a mighty earthquake, for an angel of the Lord has descended from the heavens. His eyes as lightning, and his raiment as white as snow. For the fear of him, the gods did shake and fall down like dead men. Brave soldiers that have never been afraid of human power taking captives without sword or spear. For the face that he beheld today was not the face of a mortal warrior, but the face of the captain of the Lord's army, the power of his resurrection. They watched as he rolled away the heavy stone, as one who rolled away a tiny pebble. And Jesus stepped out of the grave proclaiming, "Oh death, where is thy sting? Oh grave, where is thy victory? Open up your gates and let the King of glory come on in." Who is the King of glory? He's the Lord God, strong and mighty. Who is the King of glory? Come on, these kings of peace. That's the way to go. Story ends. I'm back of the heroes again.
Jesus Christ, the Son of God.